It begins in a place that looks almost ordinary, a narrow street, a doorway, a family packing what little they can carry. But look closer, because nothing about this moment is ordinary. A German officer stands at the edge of the frame, checking a list with the calmness of a man organizing luggage, not lives. A mother whispers to her child that they're just being moved, though she has no idea where the road ends. And somewhere, beyond the walls of the ghetto, a train whistle cuts through the air like a warning no one understands yet. This is the moment history tries to blur, the moment right before the world shifts from imprisonment to annihilation. People still believe they're being resettled for work. They don't know the real destination. They don't know that the trains waiting for them aren't taking them somewhere. They're taking them away. If you stay with me, we're going to walk into the exact second the deception ends, where the lies unravel and the machinery of extermination reveals itself piece by piece. Don't look away now, because this is the moment humanity did. Chapter 1. The Ghetto Blueprint. Nazi plans before the walls went up. It begins with a map, an ordinary-looking map pinned to a wall in a German administration office. Lines are drawn across a city grid, red pencil strokes slicing through neighborhoods that have stood for centuries. A German officer leans over it, tapping a section with the back of his pen. He does this calmly, almost casually, as if deciding where to build a new road. But he's not planning construction. He's planning confinement. Outside, life still looks normal. Market stalls open. Children chatter. But inside that room, behind those quiet strokes of a pencil, the fate of tens of thousands is being sealed. No walls have gone up yet. No barbed wire has been stretched. And yet, the trap is already closing. It is the moment before people realize the ground beneath them has shifted, a moment thick with a danger they cannot see, because the Nazi blueprint for the ghettos is already complete long before anyone is forced inside. When the Germans invaded Poland in the autumn of 1939, they didn't come only with soldiers and tanks. They arrived with ideas, dark, calculated ideas that had been brewing in Nazi offices for years. Ideas about racial hierarchy, segregation, and how to reshape entire communities with a single signature or decree. To most people watching the Wehrmacht roll through city streets, it looked like the beginning of occupation. But behind closed doors, what was happening was something far more chilling. The quiet bureaucratic birth of a system designed to isolate, suffocate, and eventually erase an entire people. Before the first barbed wire was set in place, there were already meetings where officers spoke of Jewish districts and resettlement zones with a cold certainty that revealed just how far ahead the planning had gone. In the first weeks after occupation, Jewish life in Polish cities still retained traces of normalcy. Synagogues stood untouched. Shops remained open. People whispered about new rules but tried to believe this would pass. Yet every day brought another decree, another restriction, each one tightening an invisible rope. Jews were ordered to wear identifying armbands. Their businesses were marked, their savings frozen, their freedom stripped away piece by piece. It was not chaos. It was method. Each decree worked like a gear in a machine that had already been designed months earlier. The Germans didn't improvise the ghettos. They prepared the ground slowly, deliberately, and with chilling bureaucratic precision. If you could walk through a German administrative building in late 1939, you would smell ink and paper, the scent of a different kind of warfare. Clerks typed directives about where Jews could walk, which jobs they could hold, what areas they could live in. Maps were spread across tables, covered in small wooden markers representing entire communities. Orders were phrased in dry, official language that disguised the cruelty beneath them. Terms like population transfer and residential reorganization were sprinkled through memos that made the coming catastrophe sound like mere urban planning. Inside those offices, you wouldn't hear gunshots or screams. You would hear the scratching of pens, and that sound, quiet as it was, marked the beginning of the end. To understand how the ghettos took shape, you have to understand the ideology behind them. The Nazis believed that Jews were not merely undesirable, but dangerous, contaminants to the so-called racial purity of the Reich. This was not just prejudice. It was policy. Their worldview imagined society as a kind of biological body, and they saw Jews as an infection. By that twisted logic, segregation became a medical necessity, a way to protect what they called the German organism. This wasn't just evil. It was evil disguised as science, wrapped in charts and pseudo-intellectual nonsense that gave bureaucrats the illusion of moral purpose. In Nazi ideology, cruelty always wore the mask of rationality. By the end of 1939, the German authorities had already identified districts in cities like Lodz, Warsaw, and Lublin, where Jews would soon be concentrated. These choices were not random. They looked for neighborhoods already crowded and impoverished, areas where infrastructure was weak, because suffering, in their view, was not a byproduct. It was the point. The ghettos were meant to suffocate. The cramped streets and crumbling buildings amplified disease and starvation. German planners understood this. They expected it. They counted on it. A ghetto was designed to be a slow-motion catastrophe, one that required no bullets and no gas chambers. Yet, in those early months, some German officials debated what the final solution actually meant. Deportation, forced labor, expulsion beyond Europe. The frightening truth is that even without a final answer, they already knew the first step: isolation. Before you destroy a people, you separate them. You cut them off from the world. You make them invisible. And so, in city after city, Jews were pushed into designated areas. At first gently, with notices posted on walls. Then harshly, with beatings in the streets. Doors shut, districts sealed, paths narrowed. The boundaries emerged not as physical walls at first, but as lines in the mind, lines that would soon harden into something unbreakable. Inside Jewish communities, the fear grew quietly at first. People felt it in the way neighbors avoided speaking to them. They felt it in the sudden emptiness of once crowded markets after curfews were imposed. They felt it in the cold stares of German soldiers stationed on corners, watching them with blank, unreadable eyes. Sounds changed, too. The laughter of children became whispers. The clatter of carts became rushed footsteps. There was a heaviness in the air, like a storm gathering. Everyone sensed that something far worse was coming, though no one could yet picture its shape. From a German perspective, ghettos served multiple purposes. Economically, Jewish labor could be exploited without any rights or protections. Administratively, entire populations could be monitored, controlled, and policed with minimal effort. Militarily, segregation reduced the chance of resistance. But above all, ghettos were a test, a trial run for something bigger. The Nazis wanted to see how confinement worked on a grand scale. How many people could be packed into a few streets? How quickly would disease spread? How efficiently could Jewish councils carry out German orders? Every answer fed back into the system, refining the larger plan. As early as November 1939, internal memos from Nazi officials used the phrase interim solution. The ghettos were not the end goal. They were way stations, temporary holding zones for Jews until the Reich determined what to do next. This is the part that chills historians even today. The ghettos were designed with transition in mind. The walls had not yet risen, but the planners were already thinking about what would follow them. They imagined trains. They imagined distant territories. Some spoke vaguely of resettling Jews outside Europe to Madagascar or Siberia. Others hinted at harsher measures. Nothing was finalized, yet everything pointed toward elimination. By the winter of 1940, the world inside occupied Poland felt divided by more than language or uniform. There were two realities living side by side. In German offices, officers discussed Jewish populations like numbers on a spreadsheet. In Jewish homes, mothers whispered to their children to stay near, to avoid eye contact, to not draw attention. In one world, Jews were an abstract problem. In the other, they were human beings bracing for a storm without knowing when it would break. This disconnect, this chasm between the planners and the planned upon, is part of what made the Nazi system so terrifying. People often imagine ghettos beginning with walls. In truth, they began with isolation, with curfews, with bans, with forced identification, with slicing up cities so that Jews had fewer and fewer places to walk. The first wall was psychological. The second was administrative. The third was geographic. Only later would the bricks follow. You could feel this tightening through the smallest details. A street suddenly closed, a bakery refusing service, a German guard posted outside a district that once needed none. It was like watching a cage assemble itself around you one bar at a time. Even some German citizens, observing the early policies from afar, believed the ghettos were temporary. Some imagined them as labor districts. Others saw them as a measure to maintain order. But the language used inside Nazi offices told a different story. Officials wrote about cleansing urban space and removing parasitic elements. They used phrases usually reserved for pests or disease. This dehumanization was not an accident. It was preparation. When a regime trains its administrators to describe people as contaminants, the path to extermination becomes frighteningly short. The speed with which these early plans unfolded is staggering. Within mere months, cities that had been multicultural for centuries were redrawn. Jewish families were ordered to move under threat of beating or arrest. Belongings were limited to what could be carried. Homes were abandoned overnight. Pets left behind. Furniture sold for pennies. Every sound inside these districts echoed with panic. Doors slamming, carts creaking, children crying, elders gasping for breath as they struggled to keep pace with forced relocations. The ghetto blueprint was coming to life. Once Jews were concentrated into designated areas, the rest of the city changed, too. Streets that once bustled with Yiddish, Hebrew, and Polish voices grew quieter. Synagogues were vandalized or seized. Jewish shops were handed to German administrators. A cultural world that had taken centuries to build began collapsing in weeks. And yet, no gas chambers existed. No transports had begun. The machinery of mass murder had not yet switched on. That is what makes this chapter so haunting. The destruction had begun without a single shot fired. German officials documented everything. Lists of residents, maps of each street, calculations of how many people could be forced into a single building. Bureaucracy became a weapon, and the more detailed their records became, the easier it was to manipulate, relocate, and eventually deport entire communities. Many survivors later recall that the scariest thing about the early occupation was not the shouting soldiers, but the quiet administrators, men who killed with paper instead of bullets. The first months of ghetto planning also revealed a disturbing truth. There was no chaos inside the Nazi system. To the victims, daily life felt unpredictable and terrifying. But to the planners, it was orderly. Each decree followed another like steps in a staircase leading downward. The design was methodical. The cruelty intentional. The ghettos were always meant to be temporary, always meant to be transitional, always meant to be the beginning of something much worse. And that something worse was already forming in whispers. Rumors circulated among SS officers about new ideas coming from Berlin, about ultimate solutions and territorial options. Planners mentioned potential relocation sites, so far away that survival would be impossible. Some officials spoke openly of letting disease carry out the work nature had failed to do. Others hinted that industrial methods might soon take over. It was all vague, none of it finalized, but the direction was unmistakable. The ghettos were not an end. They were a door. And beyond that door lay something no one yet dared to speak aloud. As the year turned toward 1940, the pressure inside Jewish districts reached a breaking point. Streets overflowed. Food ran out. Disease spread through overcrowded rooms thick with the smell of sweat, sickness, and desperation. People looked at one another and asked the same question in quiet, trembling voices. What comes next? They did not know that the answer was already being drafted in offices they would never see, by men whose names they would never know. The blueprint was complete. The walls were about to rise. And the trains, those trains, were already being discussed. And as we end this chapter, the final terrible truth emerges. The ghettos were never the destination. They were always meant to be the waiting room for something far more catastrophic. something that would arrive on steel rails, with sealed doors and no return. The question hanging in the air is simple and devastating. If the ghettos are only the beginning, what is waiting at the end of the line? Chapter 2: Sealing the Streets. The construction of Jewish ghettos. It begins with a hammer strike. One sharp, echoing crack in the early morning air. A German policeman lifts a wooden plank against the frame of a narrow street entrance in Warsaw, nails it in place, and steps back as if admiring simple carpentry. But this isn't carpentry. This is a border being born. Behind him, other men unroll coils of barbed wire, dragging them across cobblestones still wet with dawn. The metal scrapes the ground with a thin, metallic hiss. A shopkeeper pauses mid-step, watching the scene unfold, gripping his basket so tightly the wicker creaks. He asks a guard what's happening. The guard doesn't answer. He doesn't need to. The meaning is obvious. A wall is rising, one plank, one wire, one silent order at a time. And it doesn't just divide a street. It divides existence. On one side, a future still unknown. On the other, a cage tightening around a people who woke up that morning thinking this was still their city. By the beginning of 1940, the transformation of Jewish life in Nazi-occupied Poland had accelerated at a speed that felt almost unreal. Cities where Jews had lived for centuries, Warsaw, Krakow, Lodz, Lublin, became sites of a massive social engineering project. German authorities were no longer testing ideas. They were executing them. The ghettos were no longer distant plans discussed in administrative rooms. They were being forced into physical reality, barriers rising in the streets, checkpoints appearing overnight, German patrol routes redrawn to encircle entire districts like a tightening fist. What had once been invisible lines on a German map were now wooden barricades blocking intersections, each one patrolled by cold eyes and loaded rifles. If you walked through these districts in the early days of construction, you would hear a strange mixture of sounds. The rhythmic pounding of nails as walls went up. The rumble of carts pushed by families being forced to relocate. The sharp, authoritative bark of German orders echoing down streets. And beneath all of it, the low murmur of confusion, fear, and disbelief from residents who couldn't yet grasp the scale of what was unfolding. It was a soundscape of dislocation, architecture and humanity rearranged under the iron weight of occupation. The choice of locations for the ghettos was deliberate. German authorities selected the most impoverished, densely populated quarters within each city, areas already lacking adequate sanitation, medical access, or infrastructure. The intention was crystal clear: maximize control, minimize cost, and ensure suffering without wasting bullets. In Warsaw, the ghetto would eventually cram more than 400,000 Jews into a few square kilometers, transforming lively urban streets into suffocating corridors of desperation. In Lodz, the chosen district was a run-down, industrial zone, poorly connected to the rest of the city, making it easier to isolate and starve its new inhabitants. Every choice, every street corner, every barrier was part of the system engineered with cold efficiency. The physical sealing of these areas wasn't a single event. It was a creeping transformation, both sudden and gradual, jarring and subtle. One day, a street might be open. The next, a checkpoint appears, staffed by soldiers who don't bother explaining themselves. A week later, wooden fences rise along the edges of the district. The following month, barbed wire is added, then reinforced, then replaced with brick walls that block out daylight in places. It happened too fast for communities to adapt, yet slow enough for the terror to sink in deeply, leaving people to watch helplessly as their world shrank block by block. To understand the scale of this transformation, imagine waking up in the home your family has lived in for generations, only to find that you're suddenly forbidden from crossing a street you've walked your entire life. Imagine being told that your place of work is now outside the authorized zone, and you must leave your job. Imagine hearing rumors that new families are being forced into your building, entire households pushed into cramped rooms with peeling wallpaper and broken windows. Imagine officials marking your door, counting your belongings, and telling you that, for the good of the Reich, you must move. All of it enforced with rifles and boots. These were not policies. They were invasions of daily life. As ghettos formed, Jewish families arrived in waves, often carrying only what they could hold. The sight of these migrations became a defining image of early ghetto construction. Exhausted parents balancing suitcases, children clutching toys or blankets, elders leaning on walking sticks as they shuffled through narrow streets, herded by soldiers. The air carried the smell of sweat, stale clothing, and fear so thick it seemed to cling to the very walls. People stumbled through familiar neighborhoods that now felt foreign, even hostile. And when they reached the ghetto boundaries, they entered a space that seemed to shrink with every breath. In some cities, the walls went up so quickly that residents felt as if the world had pivoted overnight. In Krakow, once a thriving hub of Jewish culture, the establishment of the ghetto and the Podgorz district tore apart families and erased centuries of belonging. People watched from behind the newly erected fences as trams rolled by without stopping, carrying passengers who barely glanced at the sealed streets. That disconnect, the sight of normal life continuing just outside the barrier, was its own kind of torture. It reinforced the message the Nazis wanted to send. You are outside the world now. You are cut off. You no longer belong. The German strategy relied not only on physical confinement, but psychological domination. Every barrier was a message. Every checkpoint a reminder. Every soldier a symbol. Jews were made to feel less like citizens and more like prisoners, yet the ghettos were not officially called prisons. That was part of the cruelty. German officials described them as residential districts or special zones, hiding brutality under layers of bureaucratic language. But anyone who crossed the boundary could sense the truth. On the German side, the streets were wide, orderly, clean. On the Jewish side, overcrowding grew by the day, turning entire neighborhoods into labyrinths of hunger, sickness, and suffocating heat in summer, freezing drafts in winter. The construction of the ghettos also required a workforce, and the Nazis forced Jews to build the very walls that would imprison them. Men were rounded up, handed tools, and ordered to erect barriers under the watchful eyes of armed guards. Imagine the emotional weight of those tasks, hammering nails into wooden planks knowing that each strike helped seal your own community behind walls. Lifting bricks for a structure designed to restrict your every movement. Dragging barbed wire that you knew would one day tear the skin of someone trying desperately to escape. These were acts of survival twisted into acts of entrapment. Inside the ghettos, conditions deteriorated rapidly. As families were squeezed into fewer and fewer living spaces, privacy evaporated. Rooms meant for one or two people now held entire families of 10 or more. Floors sagged under the weight of too many footsteps. The smell of unwashed bodies grew overpowering. Windows were nailed shut to prevent contact with the outside world. The heat in the summer was suffocating. In the winter, cold pierced the thin walls and settled into bones. The Germans created environments where survival itself became a daily battle. Food shortages were immediate and devastating. The German authorities allocated rations that were mathematically insufficient for life, sometimes barely a few hundred calories a day. Bread became precious. Potatoes became luxuries. People boiled weeds, chewed stale scraps, and bartered every possession they had for a handful of flour. Hunger gnawed at everyone, its presence constant and merciless. You could hear the growling stomachs of children in the silence of the night. You could see the hollow cheeks and trembling hands of adults trying to hide their weakness. Malnutrition wasn't an accident. It was a weapon. The silence outside the ghetto walls was equally oppressive. On the German side, life went on. Shops open, trams running, music drifting from cafes. But inside, everything felt muted, as if the air itself resisted carrying sound. People whispered, not because of fear alone, but because they had lost the energy to speak loudly. Even laughter, when it occurred, was subdued, like a faint echo from another time. The contrast between the two worlds made the confinement feel even more suffocating. It was like being buried alive while listening to life continue just beyond reach. German officials justified the sealing of ghettos with claims about sanitation, public order, and security. They accused Jews of spreading disease, of being criminals, of being unclean. These were lies, but effective ones, especially when paired with propaganda posters, staged photographs, and speeches designed to dehumanize an entire population. The Nazis used fear to isolate Jews further, teaching the rest of the population that contact with ghetto residents was dangerous. This made empathy a crime and indifference a habit. It turned bystanders into silent collaborators. But beneath the weight of German power, Jewish communities tried to preserve fragments of their former lives. Secret schools were organized in cramped apartments. Rabbis whispered prayers in back rooms. Musicians played quietly by candlelight to give people moments of escape. Women formed underground networks to trade food, medicine, and information. Children played improvised games in courtyards, using makeshift toys carved from scraps of wood. These acts, small as they were, became lifelines, a way to reclaim humanity in a system designed to strip it away. At the same time, resistance took root in subtle forms. People smuggled food through holes in the walls, bribed guards to let them pass, forged documents, dug tunnels, shared whispered warnings about upcoming raids. These acts were incredibly dangerous, punishable by beatings, imprisonment, or execution, but they represented a refusal to surrender completely. Even within the walls of the ghettos, the human will to survive found a way to flicker. As construction progressed, the ghettos became increasingly sealed. In Warsaw, by the fall of 1940, the Germans erected a wall more than 3 meters high, topped with jagged shards of glass and coils of rusting barbed wire. Guards patrolled the perimeter day and night, their boots crunching on gravel, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They watched for anyone approaching the wall too closely. A shadow near the barrier after dark could lead to a shot fired without warning. Parents warned their children that the wall itself was dangerous, not only for what it kept out, but for what it punished. Even communication with the outside world became almost impossible. Letters were censored or never delivered. Radios were confiscated. Newspapers were banned. The silence became a prison of its own. Without news, rumors took over. Rumors of mass shootings in forests, of new German policies, of deportations that vanished entire villages. Each whisper carried a mix of truth and fear, making it difficult for Jews to understand what awaited them beyond the walls. And that uncertainty, that inability to know what came next, was part of the psychological torment the Germans intended. By late 1940 and early 1941, the ghettos across occupied Poland were sealed completely. Gates were locked at night. Passes were required for entry or exit, though very few were granted. The ghettos were living mausoleums, crowded, starving, disease-ridden, and devoid of rights. Typhus spread rapidly through unclean water and overcrowded rooms. Hospitals overflowed. Cemeteries expanded. Every street carried the scent of illness and the constant sound of coughing. Doctors worked tirelessly with almost no supplies, treating patients with whatever scraps of medicine could be smuggled in. The Germans monitored everything with cold precision. Daily population counts, death tallies, records of food distribution, labor assignments, and disease outbreaks. These statistics were not used to improve conditions, but to tighten control. They helped planners adjust ration policies, reorganize living arrangements, and determine how many Jews could be exploited for forced labor. It was a system that measured suffering not with empathy, but with efficiency. By this point, the ghettos had become so crowded that even the simplest actions became exhausting. Standing in line for bread could take hours and end with nothing. Fetching water required weaving through mobs of desperate people. Finding space to sleep meant navigating cramped rooms filled with makeshift cots and blankets spread across floors. Privacy didn't exist. Grief had no room for quiet expression. Life became an unending struggle for survival. And still, no one knew the full extent of what the Nazis were planning. The construction of ghettos wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The Germans now had populations confined, weakened, and dependent. Every element of ghetto design, crowding, starvation, disease, isolation, served a purpose. The suffering was real, overwhelming, but to Nazi planners, it was merely the first phase. A phase that would make the next step easier. And that next step was already being whispered in the darkness. Officials in Berlin were debating the future. Some demanded complete removal. Others spoke of evacuation to the east. Meetings were held behind closed doors, where maps were marked not with city streets, but with railway lines. Trains were mentioned more often. Transport capacity, departure points, schedules. Inside the ghettos, no one knew it yet, but the walls weren't the final barrier. They were the waiting room for something far more devastating. Something that would arrive not with soldiers breaking down doors, but with whistles blowing in the night and the clatter of wheels on steel rails. And as the last streets were sealed and the final gates slammed shut, the ghettos stood silent, crowded, and trembling in the cold air. People looked at the walls and thought the worst had already come. They were wrong, because just beyond those walls, the trains were already being prepared. Chapter 3: Life Behind the Walls. Starvation, Disease, and Survival. It begins with a single sound, a child coughing in the dark. Not a loud cough, not the kind that makes you turn your head, but a thin, fragile rasp. The kind that tells you there's no medicine, no doctor, no warmth, and no escape. The room around her is crowded with sleeping bodies, each one curled tightly to conserve heat. The air is dense, heavy with the smell of unwashed skin, stale breath, and fear that never fully settles. Outside the window, sealed shut with boards to prevent contact with the world beyond, a German patrol walks past, boots hitting the pavement with mechanical rhythm. The child coughs again. Her mother pulls her closer, whispering that morning will come soon. But morning brings little comfort here. Because in the ghettos, survival is not measured in days. It is measured in moments. Each breath a small victory, each cough a reminder of the thin line between life and death. By early 1941, life inside the sealed ghettos had settled into a grim routine, if the word routine can be used to describe a world defined by constant deprivation. The walls were no longer new. The checkpoints no longer surprising. The forced relocations had become a memory, replaced by overcrowded buildings where every creaking floorboard and every thin blanket carried the weight of too many lives stacked on top of one another. Streets that once echoed with conversation, music, and commerce now pulsed with the slow, dragging steps of people too weakened by hunger to move quickly. And yet, despite all this, life persisted. Not life as it once was, but a new, harsh, fragile version held together by instinct, hope, habit, and the stubborn human refusal to disappear quietly. The first thing anyone noticed upon entering the ghetto was the smell. It clung to everything: the air, the walls, the fabric of clothing. A mixture of overcrowded rooms, wet laundry hung indoors for lack of space, the sour scent of sickness, the sharp bite of disinfectant used too sparingly, and the earthy rot of garbage that could not be removed quickly enough. It was a smell of bodies forced into impossible proximity, of disease without medicine, of food too scarce, and too precious to waste on even the smallest crumbs. For many, the scent alone was enough to imprint a lifetime of memory in a single breath. Hunger became the defining force of daily life. German-imposed rations in most ghettos were mathematically impossible to survive on. In Warsaw, the official German ration for Jews was sometimes less than a few hundred calories a day. A slice of bread, a spoonful of watery soup, maybe a handful of barley, if someone was lucky. People lined up for hours in front of distribution points, clutching ration cards with trembling hands, praying the food would not run out before their turn. Often it did. The gnawing emptiness inside their stomachs became a constant companion, a quiet pain that sharpened over time until it felt like knives from within. Children cried for food in voices that were more whimpers than wails. Adults tried to hide their hunger, not wanting to show weakness in front of their families. But the truth was simple. The ghettos were built to starve people slowly, predictably, efficiently. To survive, smuggling became a lifeline and a miracle. Children especially took on this dangerous task. They squeezed through small gaps in the walls, crawled under barriers, bribed guards, or sprinted across open ground hoping to outrun the bullets. Their small bodies were harder to hit, their agility an advantage. Many did not return. Those who did often carried nothing more than a few potatoes hidden under their shirts, a piece of bread tucked into a sock, or a handful of vegetables wrapped in cloth. But these small victories could mean the difference between another day of life or another day closer to death. The taste of smuggled bread, dry, coarse, barely edible, felt like a feast. Disease moved through the ghettos with horrifying speed. Typhus, spread by lice in overcrowded rooms, became a constant threat. Fevers rose unchecked. Rashes spread across thin, fragile skin. People shivered under blankets that did little to stop the cold. Hospitals, already scarce and poorly equipped, were overwhelmed. Doctors did what they could with almost nothing. No antibiotics, limited bandages, little access to clean water. They worked long hours, often collapsing from exhaustion themselves. The sound of coughing echoed constantly, from dawn to dusk, from room to room, from building to building, an unbroken stream of illness. The Germans claimed that the ghettos were sources of disease, using this lie to justify further restrictions. But the truth was simpler. The disease spread because the ghettos were designed to foster it. They were built to facilitate the slow destruction of life without requiring overt acts of violence. And yet, despite everything, communities tried to hold on to fragments of normalcy. Daily life was full of contradictions, despair, and determination living side by side within the same walls. Teachers held secret classes in cramped apartments, whispering lessons in mathematics, literature, history, and faith. Children sat on the floor or shared one chair between 4 or 5 of them. For those precious hours, they were students again, not prisoners. Musicians gathered in courtyards or behind shuttered windows, playing violins or makeshift instruments crafted from scraps. The melodies were faint, sometimes hopeful, sometimes mournful, but they reminded people that their identity had not been erased, even if everything else had been stolen. The Jewish councils, the Judenrat, formed under German orders, were forced to manage these impossible conditions. Their task was both administrative and agonizing. They distributed rations they knew were insufficient. They assigned forced labor quotas. They negotiated with German authorities, sometimes managing to ease small restrictions, other times being forced into heartbreaking decisions. Many council members believed they were buying time. Time for their communities, time for their families, time for some future unknown. Time that, in the end, the Nazis would never allow. Walking through the ghetto streets was a sensory experience unlike any other. The cobblestones felt uneven and cold underfoot. The buildings leaned at odd angles from the weight of too many inhabitants. The narrow alleys were filled with people moving slowly, their expressions hollow, their eyes fixed on some invisible point ahead. The air tasted metallic, as though breathing itself required effort. In winter, icy winds blasted through gaps between buildings, chilling any exposed skin and making each breath sting. In summer, heat pooled in the narrow corridors, turning them into suffocating channels of dust and sweat. The seasons brought different challenges, but the suffering remained constant. In the evenings, when the gates were locked, quiet settled over the ghettos like a heavy blanket. People huddled together in their rooms, sharing what warmth they could. Candles flickered, casting long shadows across walls scratched with markings. Notes, prayers, dates, names, or simply the desperate tally marks of passing days. Some nights were filled with distant gunshots. others with silence, so complete it felt unnatural. But always, there was the underlying sense of waiting. Waiting for morning, waiting for food, waiting for news, waiting for something, anything, to change. Forced labor became another daily reality. Jews were required to work in workshops, factories, cleaning brigades, or construction crews under brutal conditions. They patched uniforms, repaired German equipment, swept streets, and performed heavy labor with little nourishment. The belief among many was that work meant survival, that as long as they remained useful, the Germans might spare them. This belief became a fragile shield against despair, even as people collapsed on the job, fainted in the heat, or shivered in the cold. Hands blistered, muscles ached, backs bent under weight that should never have been carried by underfed bodies. But people pushed on, because stopping meant punishment. Inside homes, people rationed every scrap of food. Families shared one potato among many. Parents gave their portions to children. Meals that once took minutes to prepare now stretched into hours as people scraped pots for every remaining bit. The sound of stirring thin soup became part of the daily rhythm. Hunger sharpened the senses. People could smell bread from blocks away, feel the faintest warmth near cooking fires, hear the rustling of paper wrapping food. But hunger also dulled judgment, making people weak, dizzy, unable to think clearly. The body became a battlefield where survival was fought inch by inch. Despite unbearable conditions, the ghettos were not devoid of light. Friends comforted each other. Lovers met in secret. Weddings took place in crowded rooms lit by candles. The vows exchanged soft but unwavering. Every celebration, no matter how small, felt like an act of resistance, a declaration that the Nazis could break their bodies but not extinguish their humanity. Children still found ways to play, chasing each other through alleys or inventing games with scraps of wood or bits of string. Their laughter, brief but real, broke through the gloom like shards of sunlight. Some ghetto residents kept diaries, quiet records of daily life, written in trembling handwriting by candlelight. These journals, discovered after the war, buried in walls, hidden under floorboards, or concealed in jars beneath rubble, reveal the intimate details the Germans never documented. The taste of smuggled apples, the desperation of selling family heirlooms for bread, the pain of watching loved ones fade away, the guilt of stealing food for one child while another starved. These diaries are the voices that survived when their authors did not. But alongside these small moments of resistance and resilience, death became a constant presence. Bodies were found in streets each morning, victims of starvation, disease, or exhaustion. Funeral processions lost their solemnity because they became too frequent. Cemeteries expanded rapidly, taking over empty lots and unused land. Some families held makeshift funerals without coffins, wrapping loved ones in sheets and lowering them into shallow graves. The smell of death was carried on the wind, a heavy, lingering reminder of the fragility of life behind the walls. In the midst of suffering, rumors circulated constantly. News traveled through whispers about villages emptied by German forces, about mass shootings in forests, about people taken away in trucks who never returned. Whispers about something called resettlement, a word that sounded harmless but felt ominous. The air inside the ghettos grew heavier with each rumor, as people tried to imagine what was happening beyond their confined world. Some clung to hope, telling themselves that the Germans were simply relocating them for labor. Others feared the worst, but had no proof. The truth, when it finally arrived, would be far worse than even the darkest rumors. As conditions deteriorated, the ghettos became crucibles of impossible choices. Parents faced decisions about which child to feed. Doctors had to decide who among the sick would get the last vial of medicine. Young people debated whether to risk smuggling food or stay safely inside. Every choice carried consequences. Every decision weighed heavily. These moral burdens added another layer of suffering, a mental and emotional agony that left deep scars even on those who survived. The Judenrate struggled under increasing pressure. German demands grew harsher and more frequent. Lists had to be prepared. Lists of workers, lists of sick individuals, lists of families to be relocated. Some council members tried to protect their communities as best they could. Others succumbed to corruption or despair. In the end, none had the power they hoped for. The Germans controlled everything. The councils were merely tools, trapped between obedience and resistance in a system where both could lead to destruction. By late 1941, life inside the ghettos had reached a breaking point. Overcrowding intensified. Food supplies dwindled. The death rate rose sharply. Every corner of the ghettos, every building, every courtyard, every hallway carried the marks of suffering etched deeply into the stone and into the people themselves. And still, the residents waited, unaware that the ghettos were not the final design. They were temporary by intention, temporary by structure, temporary by Nazi planning. Because in German administrative offices, the next stage of the plan was already being prepared. Meetings discussed evacuations and transports. Maps were updated to include railway schedules. The word resettlement appeared more frequently. Surveyors measured distances not between streets, but between ghettos and train stations. The machinery of the next phase was already being assembled. Efficient, silent, relentless. Inside the ghettos, people sensed a shift but couldn't name it. They felt it in the increased presence of SS officers. They heard it in the new harshness of German orders. They saw it in the strange, uneasy tension that settled over the streets like a shadow. Something was coming. Something different from starvation and disease. Something more sudden, more violent, more final. And as families gathered in cramped rooms, sharing their last scraps of food, they looked into the eyes of their children and asked the same question in silence. What will happen to us next? They didn't know that the answer was already whistling in the distance, carried by steel tracks, by engines warming up, by train cars being emptied and cleaned for human cargo. They didn't know that the ghettos were not built to hold them. They were built to prepare them. And soon, the walls would open, not to freedom, but to the rails that would carry them toward a fate darker than even their nightmares dared to imagine. Chapter 4. Judenrat and Police, Between Survival and Coercion. It begins with a knock on a door that no one wants to answer. 3 sharp raps, official, cold, unmistakable. In a cramped apartment deep inside the Warsaw Ghetto, a man looks up from the small table where he's been sorting ration cards. His wife freezes mid-motion, a loaf of stale bread in her hands. The children fall silent. Everyone knows what that knock means. It isn't a neighbor. It isn't a friend. It is the sound of responsibility being forced into a man's life like a blade pressed against his back. He opens the door slowly, heart pounding, and finds 2 figures standing in the dim hallway. One is a German officer. The other is a Jewish man wearing an armband that identifies him as part of the newly formed Jewish Council. The officer does not speak. The council representative clears his throat, eyes avoiding the family behind the man in the doorway. You have been appointed, he says quietly. Report tomorrow. And with that simple sentence, the course of one man's life, and the fate of thousands around him, shifts into a terrible, unchosen path. The creation of the Judenrat was one of the Nazis' most insidious strategies. Former lawyers, teachers, businessmen, rabbis, people respected in their communities, were suddenly thrust into positions of authority they didn't ask for and didn't truly hold. On paper, they were leaders. In reality, they were prisoners with pens. Their job wasn't to govern. It was to obey, to translate German decrees into action, to take impossible orders and make them real within the walls of the ghetto, to stand between a brutal regime and a desperate population, absorbing hatred from below and pressure from above. Their existence was a trap, one that turned victims into unwilling administrators of their own people's suffering. Imagine the emotional burden these men carried. Every morning they stepped into cold, echoing council buildings, former schools or offices taken over by German command, and found lists, demands, and quotas waiting for them like instruments of torture. provide workers for forced labor, collect valuables, reduce rations, evict families from designated buildings, prepare a census. The orders came dressed in the dry language of bureaucracy, but each one was a blade pointed at someone's throat. Council members argued among themselves, desperate to find ways to soften the blows, to delay implementation, to negotiate for better terms. Sometimes they succeeded. Often they failed. The Judenrat offices smelled of damp paper and ink, the tools of a government without real power. Council members sat at worn desks, heads in their hands, trying to calculate how many men could be spared for labor without leaving elderly parents unattended. They debated which buildings were structurally safe enough to house the newest wave of displaced families. They pleaded with German officials for extra bread rations, for blankets in winter, for medicine during outbreaks. Every small concession felt like a victory. Every denial felt like another brick in the wall closing around them. They were not collaborators by choice. They were captives negotiating the terms of captivity. Jewish police forces, the Ordnungsdienst, were formed under similar circumstances. Men joined because they believed it might protect their families, because they needed food, because the Germans promised that those wearing the uniform would be exempt from certain punishments. These promises were lies, but desperate men clung to them. They were given armbands, caps, and batons, but little training. No authority outside the walls. No weapons at first. Their job was to enforce German regulations inside the ghetto, keep order, prevent smuggling, maintain curfews, control crowds at ration points. But as conditions worsened and the Germans' demands grew, their role darkened. They became enforcers of quotas, escorts during deportations, witnesses to nightmares no human should ever see. Many hated them. Some feared them. Others pitied them. But very few understood them. These were men trying to walk a tightrope stretched between survival and complicity, between protecting loved ones and obeying commands that violated every moral fiber in their bodies. They patrolled streets filled with starving neighbors, children begging for help, elders collapsing from exhaustion. They had to decide when to turn a blind eye, when to help secretly, when to risk punishment by disobeying. Every choice had consequences. Every mistake left invisible scars. In the early days of the ghettos, the Judenrat still believed, naively, desperately, that cooperation might buy time. If they complied with German orders, maybe things wouldn't get worse. Maybe they could negotiate small improvements. Maybe forced labor assignments would spare lives. Maybe they could protect the vulnerable by distributing hardship more evenly. This belief wasn't irrational. It was human. When you're trapped in a nightmare, you look for cracks of light anywhere you can find them. But the Germans understood this mentality and exploited it mercilessly. Council meetings often stretched for hours. Men shouted, cried, slammed fists on tables, argued about the ethics of their decisions. They debated whether to issue decrees that would cause suffering or resist and risk immediate retaliation. They reviewed lists of names, lists of workers, lists of food recipients, lists of the dead. The lists felt endless, a constant reminder of how many lives depended on every decision made in that room. The pressure was crushing. Some council members aged visibly within months. Others developed nervous tics or insomnia. A few took their own lives, unable to carry the weight any longer. German officials, in contrast, maintained an air of cold detachment. They visited the council only to issue orders or reprimands. Their boots echoed through hallways as they passed silently, their faces unreadable. They viewed the Judenrat not as partners, but as tools, extensions of their authority. When the council failed to meet quotas, Germans punished them publicly, stripping their privileges or imprisoning members. When the council succeeded, Germans simply increased demands. There was no reward, only escalating cruelty. The existence of the Jewish police added another layer of tension. They were seen patrolling streets in their thin uniforms, trying to maintain order without truly believing in their authority. They faced impossible dilemmas: enforce rules and become hated, or disobey and face German punishment. Some officers used their position to smuggle food or warn families of upcoming raids. Others used it to exert power in ways that reflected their own fear, hunger, and desperation. Just as in any oppressed society, there were heroes among them and villains among them, but most were simply human beings trapped in unbearable circumstances. The pressure on the Jewish police intensified as German orders became more violent. When raids occurred, sudden, brutal, chaotic, the police were often forced to assist German officers. They knocked on doors, sometimes gently, sometimes harshly, depending on the danger behind them. Some helped families escape through back windows. Others obeyed commands rigidly to protect their own families. The guilt they carried afterward was overwhelming. People spit at them in the streets. Children threw stones. The police officers kept their heads down, their eyes hollow, their shoulders bent under shame they couldn't put into words. Smuggling became a central conflict inside the ghetto, one that placed the police and the Judenrat in impossible positions. The council knew that smuggling kept people alive. They also knew that the Germans demanded strict crackdowns. The Jewish police were ordered to stop smugglers, but many officers turned a blind eye, understanding that without smuggling, starvation would consume the ghetto even faster. This blurred line between enforcement and mercy created tensions that fractured communities. Accusations flew. Trust eroded. Families took sides based on rumors. The Germans didn't need to sow division. They simply stood back and watched it grow. The Judenrat also faced family-level dilemmas. Council members received slightly better rations, slightly more protection. Their families were safer at first. This privilege made them targets of resentment, even as they worked tirelessly to help their people. Many believed they were sacrificing themselves for the community. Others struggled with feelings of guilt for receiving even small benefits while others starved. Some tried to distribute their extra rations secretly among the poor. Some refused privileges entirely. Others could not bear the judgment and withdrew emotionally from their families, distancing themselves from the pain they could not resolve. Behind closed doors, council leaders wrote letters that would never be sent, letters of apology, of explanation, of despair. They recorded their experiences in diaries, confessing fears they couldn't voice publicly. These writings reveal the depth of their torment. They describe sleepless nights, shaking hands, the faces of people whose lives were destroyed by their decisions, and the hollow feeling of signing orders they knew would break families apart. Many wrote that they didn't recognize themselves anymore, that the ghetto had turned them into shadows of who they were. The Germans intensified control by expanding the responsibilities of the Judenrat. They ordered the creation of labor departments, welfare offices, housing bureaus, health divisions. These institutions looked like the structure of a functioning city, but they were shells, managed by people without resources, operating under constant threat. Housing officials try to place families into rooms too small for animals. Welfare workers distributed scraps of food while watching children collapse in front of them. Health officials recorded death tolls that climbed with every passing day. Every department became an instrument of survival, and at the same time, an instrument of cruelty. Disease outbreaks placed even more pressure on the council. Germans blamed the Judenrat for failing to maintain sanitation, even though they had cut off water supplies and restricted access to basic necessities. Council members begged for medicine. They submitted detailed reports about typhus, tuberculosis, influenza. The Germans read the reports, shrugged, and responded with demands for labor quotas. Disease, in their eyes, was not a problem. It was a feature of the system they had designed. Forced labor assignments became another source of agony. The Germans issued quotas for workers to be sent outside the ghetto each day, often to dangerous or exhausting tasks. The Judenrat had to select who would go. Fathers were chosen over the elderly, young men over children, skilled laborers over the weak. Families begged council members to spare their loved ones. Bribes circulated: bread, clothing, valuables, anything that could buy mercy. Even council members who refused bribes knew they were being judged by everyone they couldn't save. Some tried to protect the weak. Others made decisions based on who they believed had the best chance of surviving. Every choice was a wound. As conditions worsened, German commands grew darker. They demanded lists of the elderly, lists of the sick, lists of those unfit for labor. The council hesitated, knowing what these lists might mean. But refusal meant immediate violence. Council members debated endlessly, raising their voices, pounding on tables, sweating through their shirts as they weighed the lives of their community against the wrath of the Germans. Every list they submitted felt like a betrayal. Every delay they managed felt like a temporary reprieve. The Jewish police were pulled further into this darkness. Germans armed some officers with batons and later with rifles. They were ordered to maintain order during selections, sorting people, holding back crowds, escorting the condemned. Many officers broke down afterward, unable to reconcile what they had been forced to do. Some resigned and faced punishment. Others fled their posts. A few became hardened, using their positions to gain privileges or power. But most carried out their orders with trembling hands and eyes full of anguish. One of the most painful truths of the ghettos is that the Judenrat and the Jewish police were never given a chance to succeed. They were created by the Nazis to manage suffering, not alleviate it. Their existence allowed the Germans to distance themselves from the daily brutality of ghetto life. The council distributed starvation rations, not the Germans. The police arrested smugglers, not the Germans. The council collected valuables, not the Germans. The Nazis engineered the system so that Jews carried out the oppression of other Jews, deepening the psychological torment. Yet despite all this, the Judenrat and the Jewish police also played crucial roles in survival. Council members organized soup kitchens that saved thousands. They established hospitals, schools, orphanages, workshops. They negotiated for better working conditions. They used whatever authority they had to protect as many as they could. The police, too, in many cases helped smuggle food, warned families of raids, guided children through secret passages. History often paints these groups in extremes, heroes or villains. But the truth is more complicated. They existed in the gray zone of human morality, trapped in a system designed to crush their souls. By late 1941 and early 1942, the tension inside the ghettos became unbearable. People whispered that something worse was coming, that the councils were being pressured to prepare transport lists, that the Germans were planning massive evacuations. Council members sat in silent rooms, staring at orders they couldn't comprehend. Police officers lingered at corners, shifting nervously, sensing that their uniforms would not protect them much longer. The foundations of the ghettos, already fragile, began to crack under the weight of the next phase. Because behind the walls, behind the hunger and sickness and impossible choices, the Germans were preparing a new system, one that would render the Judenrat and the Jewish police irrelevant, one that would strip away every illusion of negotiation or mediation, one that would redefine the meaning of the word transport. And as these plans formed quietly in German offices, the people inside the ghettos felt a chill unlike any they had felt before. It came not from the winter wind. It came from a whisper spreading through the population, one that no one wanted to believe, but everyone feared. The lists being prepared were not for work. They were for something far more final. Chapter 5. Labor as Punishment. Factories, workshops, and death through work. It begins before sunrise, when the air is still damp and the streets of the ghetto lie in a gray half-light. A whistle shrieks from the direction of the gate. Sharp, metallic, unmistakable. It slices through the morning haze, jolting people awake. Inside a cramped room where 10 bodies sleep on a single wooden floor, a man sits up abruptly, inhaling cold air that burns his lungs. He wipes frost from the window with the sleeve of his threadbare coat and sees them. German guards gathering at the entrance, rifles slung casually, boots planted wide in a stance that announces absolute control. Behind them, a cart waits with ropes and extra batons, tools meant for people who fail to move quickly enough. The man stands, joints stiff and swollen, and wakes his son with a whisper. It's time. There is no breakfast. There is no warmth. There is only the daily ritual of forced labor, a ritual that is burrowed into the bones of every Jew behind the walls. A ritual designed not to sustain life, but to drain it, slowly, painfully, and with bureaucratic precision. By 1940 and 1941, the ghettos were firmly established as engines of exploitation. The Nazis had not built the walls merely to confine the Jewish population. They built them to create a reservoir of cheap labor that could be extracted ruthlessly, endlessly, without cost or conscience. German companies, military offices, and municipal authorities all saw opportunity behind the barbed wire. The ghettos became labor pools, human warehouses where every man, woman, and sometimes even child represented hours of toil to be squeezed from underfed, exhausted bodies. Work was not optional. It was survival, or at least the illusion of it. For many Jews, the only hope of receiving the meager additional rations tied to labor assignments was to show up each day, no matter how sick or weak they were, no matter how blistered their hands or how swollen their legs. If they didn't work, they didn't eat. And if they didn't eat, they would not survive long enough to face whatever new cruelty the Germans had planned next. The streets each morning were filled with the shuffling of feet, heavy, slow, unsteady. Workers lined up in long, uneven columns, their breaths visible in the freezing air. Some wore boots with soles worn thin. Others tied cloth around their feet. Coats hung from their shoulders like loose skins, far too big or far too small after months of weight loss and constant wear. The smell of sweat mixed with damp drifted through the line. But beneath all that was another smell, the sweet, sickly scent of decay that came from bodies consistently starved, consistently overworked, consistently pushed beyond human limits. Guard dogs growled along the edges of the column as German officers counted heads. Move! One spat, striking a man who hesitated for a moment. His baton cracked against a man's back, sending a jolt of pain so sharp it stole his breath. The line resumed movement, inching toward the gate. This was the beginning of every workday. Work assignments varied. Some were sent to factories within the ghetto, textile workshops, metal repair shops, carpentry rooms where tools rattled and wood chips gathered underfoot. Others were marched outside the walls to German-owned factories or municipal projects, road building, snow clearing, sewer maintenance, railway repairs. Some were forced into humiliating street cleaning brigades, scraping mud and debris under the watchful eyes of German civilians and soldiers who walked past them with contemptuous stares. No job was easy. No job was safe. In sweatshops, the air was thick with dust and fumes. Needles clinked rapidly as seamstresses and tailors worked long hours stitching German uniforms, repairing boots, or assembling parachutes. Their fingers bled from repeated pricks. Their eyes strained under dim lighting that flickered unpredictably. The rooms were overcrowded, tight rows of bodies hunched over benches, shoulders pressed together, breath mixing in a stale cloud. Supervisors, often Jewish foremen appointed under duress, paced between the tables, urging faster work because they knew the Germans would punish everyone if quotas were not met. Metal workshops rang with constant clanging, iron striking iron, steel grinding against steel. Sparks flew from furnaces. Heat blasted from roaring fires. Workers pushed carts of heavy parts, their thin arms trembling, sweat dripping down their backs, even in winter. Accidents were frequent. Fingers crushed. Burns etched deeply into skin. No time for healing. No bandages available. Outside the ghetto, the world was harsher. Labor brigades marched to construction sites, with German guards flanking them. They broke stones with crude tools, swung hammers with arms that barely held strength, shoveled dirt until blisters tore open flesh. In the icy months, workers cleared snow from roads until their hands went numb and their extremities turned blue. Many lost fingers to frostbite. Others collapsed mid-task, the cold seeping into their bones like a slow poison. In summer, heat turned the work into torture. Sweat drenched clothing. Sunburn cracked exposed skin. The dust clung to their throats, making every breath feel gritty. Workers fainted, only to be dragged aside by guards who didn't pause the work for even a moment. A fainted body was an inconvenience, not a tragedy. Food was the underlying current of every shift. Workers were allotted slightly higher rations, but higher didn't mean adequate. It meant perhaps a bowl of watery soup or a small piece of bread. They worked on empty stomachs, feeling the ache of hunger pulsing through them with every movement. They learned to conserve energy by adjusting their pace, to walk slowly, lift smaller loads when the guards weren't watching, to use moments of distraction to lean against walls or catch breath. They learned the strategies of survival in a world that offered no mercy. German overseers varied in cruelty. Some barked orders with mechanical indifference. Others wielded violence like a tool, beating workers for the slightest perceived mistake. A misaligned stitch, a bent nail, a dropped brick, a cough at the wrong moment. Punishments were swift, unpredictable. Some officers seemed to relish the power, their eyes gleaming with satisfaction as they watched bruises form. Others looked bored, as though brutality was just part of their daily routine. But none showed sympathy. Inside the ghetto factories, Jewish managers lived in unbearable duality. They were chosen by the Germans to supervise production because they had skills, education, or connections. They received slightly better food, slightly better shelter. But they carried enormous guilt. They had to discipline workers, ensure quotas, sometimes report those who resisted. They walked a tightrope between compassion and fear, knowing that if production fell, the Germans would punish everyone. Many cried privately. Some kept diaries describing the torment of their roles, the feeling of being forced to become instruments of survival and agents of suffering at the same time. Work permits were currency. They were more valuable than food, more precious than gold. A work permit meant you had a reason to be kept alive. It meant you had utility in German eyes. Without one, you were vulnerable to deportation, to raids, to random killings. Families begged for work permits. Bribes became commonplace. Jewelry exchanged for paper. Valuables traded for signatures. Some forged permits, risking execution if discovered. Parents pushed their teenage children into the labor force early. Elderly men lied about their age. People exaggerated their skills, hoping to convince authorities they were indispensable. The desperation to obtain a work permit created divisions within the community. Those who had them lived with trembling relief. Those who didn't lived in fear. And all understood the same horrifying truth. The right to labor did not grant dignity. It granted temporary survival, nothing more. In workshops, the sound of sewing machines became a kind of heartbeat. Workers sewed uniforms for German soldiers who were fighting on distant fronts. They stitched coats that would be worn in lands they would never see. They repaired boots that would march through cities they would never visit. Their hands labored to support a war machine designed to exterminate them. The irony was suffocating, but the alternative was starvation. The ghettos developed their own underground economies around labor. Workers secretly pocketed scraps of fabric or metal, trading them on black markets. These items could be exchanged for bread, potatoes, or smuggled medicine. The Germans knew this happened and punished it severely when discovered. But the desperation was too great. When survival depends on finding calories that don't exist, people will take risks. Street cleaners, some of the lowest-ranking laborers, swept trash and manure, cleared frozen gutters, and hauled waste. Their work was humiliating but vital. German soldiers and officers walked past them daily, some sneering, others ignoring them entirely as though they were invisible. But to the cleaners, invisibility had value. Being beneath notice sometimes meant avoiding conflict with guards who enjoyed using their batons. The soundscape of labor was constant. Hammers striking metal, saws slicing wood, sewing machines rattling, boots marching, workers groaning under strain. These sounds never stopped. They formed the soundtrack of the ghettos. But beneath all this industry, the Nazis were not trying to preserve Jewish life. They were draining it. Work served two purposes: to support the German war effort and to weaken the Jewish population physically and emotionally. The system was designed to exhaust, deplete, and destroy. Even in places where productivity increased, conditions never improved. The Germans didn't want efficiency. They wanted obedience and degradation. Deaths during labor were common. A man collapsing under a heavy load might be kicked aside. A woman fainting from exhaustion might be slapped awake. If she didn't rise, she was left where she fell. The brigade continued without her. The work never paused. People died in fields, on roadsides, inside factories, and sometimes on the very floors where they had been sewing or hammering moments before. Their bodies were removed quickly, without ceremony, without dignity. Those who survived did so by conserving energy, by sharing tiny bits of food, by supporting one another when they stumbled. Workers formed small groups, unspoken alliances based on mutual protection. They helped each other lift heavy loads. They warned each other when guards approached. They passed around scraps of bread. These small acts of solidarity were quiet rebellions against a system built on cruelty. Inside the ghettos, labor also became a psychological battle. People struggled with the feeling that their bodies no longer belonged to them. They felt owned by the Germans, by the factories, by the brutal rhythm of work that offered no rest. Dreams became consumed by images of labor: needles, bricks, shovels, boots, hammers. Some woke in the night mimicking the motions of their daytime jobs, hands twitching in sleep as though still stitching or lifting. Families suffered the consequences of labor. Parents returned home so exhausted they could barely speak. Children watched their mothers' hands tremble as they tried to feed them. Husbands saw the deep lines etched into their wives' faces. Wives helped wash the bruises on their husbands' arms. The emotional weight grew heavier each day. Love didn't disappear, but it became strained under the pressure of survival. The Germans monitored labor output constantly. They demanded faster production, higher quotas. They punished entire units for individual mistakes. They used starvation as a tool to force compliance. The more exhausted workers became, the easier they were to control. It was a vicious cycle, a system engineered to break people slowly enough to squeeze every last drop of labor from their bodies. German companies profited greatly. Businesses like Siemens, IG Farben, and countless smaller firms benefited from this forced labor. Municipal governments used Jewish workers to maintain city infrastructure at no cost. The ghettos became economic engines built on suffering, their productivity a grotesque parody of normal commerce. The Judenrat tried to negotiate better conditions. They requested more food for workers, better tools, safer environments. Sometimes they succeeded. More often, they were ignored. But they continued trying because they knew that for every improvement, no matter how small, lives were extended, even if only for days or weeks. As 1941 ended and 1942 approached, a shift occurred. Work no longer guaranteed survival, even temporarily. New German orders hinted at something else, something darker. Labor quotas increased suddenly. Work permits were reissued with strange limitations. Rumors spread that the ghettos were being cleaned of those not deemed essential. German officers became colder, more distant. Workers returned home to find neighbors gone, apartments suddenly empty, belongings scattered across floors. The first deportations began. Small at first, quiet, almost hidden, but the connection was unmistakable. The system of forced labor had served its purpose. It had weakened the population, organized them into records, identified the strongest and the weakest, and conditioned them to obey German commands without question. The ghettos had become reservoirs of human labor. Now, they would become reservoirs of something far more horrifying. As workers marched back from another grueling day, the sun dipping low behind the ghetto walls, many sensed a new tension in the air. German guards were whispering among themselves. Council members looked pale, distressed. The lines of the gates felt different, tighter, more controlled. The dogs barked more than usual. Something was coming. And soon, the people who had spent months laboring to prolong their lives would be confronted with the reality that the next phase of the German plan did not involve their labor at all. It involved their removal, their transport, and the trains that had once been tools of commerce and industry would soon become instruments of something far more lethal. The question was no longer how long people could survive the work. It was how long they had before the work ended. Chapter 6, The Ghettos Tighten, 1941, and the turn toward radicalization. It begins with a sound that wasn't heard in the ghettos before, the distant thunder of artillery, muffled and far away, rolling across the summer skies of 1941. It vibrates faintly through the walls, through the floors, through the bones of anyone paying attention. A woman sitting by a small window in the Krakow ghetto pauses mid-stitch, hearing it. She doesn't know what it means yet. No one does. All they know is that something has shifted. The Germans seem more alert. Troops have been moving in unusual numbers. Rumors swirl like dust in the cramped alleys. And still that low, distant rumble continues, growing not louder, but closer. What the ghetto doesn't yet understand is that the sound marks the beginning of something far worse than starvation, disease, or labor. It marks the beginning of systematic killing on a scale unlike anything in human history. When Operation Barbarossa launches, when German forces invade the Soviet Union, the war expands, not just geographically, but ideologically, violently, mercilessly. And that ideological expansion will reshape the ghettos forever. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 wasn't just a military operation. It was, in the minds of Nazi leadership, a crusade, a war of annihilation designed to destroy what Hitler called Judeo-Bolshevism. The language used by Nazi officials became sharper, harsher, more openly murderous. They spoke not of defeating an enemy army, but of destroying entire populations. Jews were no longer just scapegoats or undesirables. They were now considered racial enemies, whose elimination was necessary for Germany's future. This shift in ideology didn't stay confined to military headquarters. It spread outward like poison, reaching every occupied territory, every ghetto, every German administrative office. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Inside the ghettos, the change was felt not through speeches or official proclamations, but through actions. German soldiers stationed near the ghettos seemed more aggressive. Patrols grew more frequent. Punishments became harsher. The casual violence, already a daily threat, took on a sharper edge, as if the soldiers were operating under new permission to unleash cruelty. Suddenly, the idea that the ghettos were temporary waiting rooms no longer felt like a distant fear. It felt like an unfolding reality. German authorities began issuing new demands to the Jewish councils, demands that hinted at a darker purpose. They required more detailed population lists, names, ages, occupations, health conditions. They requested reports on the number of elderly, the number of children, the number of those unable to work. These weren't administrative tasks. They were preparations. Council members sensed this, but couldn't articulate what they feared. They told themselves that the Germans were refining labor assignments, reorganizing population statistics. But the truth lingered in the back of their minds like a shadow. The Germans were selecting. And outside the ghettos, in small forests, ravines, and fields across Eastern Europe, something unprecedented began. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, followed the German army into newly conquered territories. Their orders were chillingly simple. Kill Jews, kill political commissars, kill anyone deemed a threat. They arrived in towns and villages, gathered entire Jewish populations, marched them to pits, and shot them. The sound of gunfire echoed through landscapes that had never known such mass violence. Bodies filled ravines. Blood soaked the earth. And the reports of these killings traveled, slowly, in whispers, through underground channels, toward the ghettos. The people inside the ghettos didn't know specifics. They heard fragments. Hundreds dead in Vilnius. Thousands murdered in Babi Yar. No survivors in this town, or that one. These stories seemed impossible to believe. How could entire communities disappear in a single day? How could the Germans kill, so many so quickly. Many dismissed the reports as exaggerations born from fear. But the tension in the air grew heavier with each passing week. The German invasion also accelerated hunger and disease inside the ghettos. Supplies that once trickled through black markets dried up as German troops consumed everything they could seize from confiscated Soviet territories. The ghetto populations felt the shift immediately. The lines at ration points grew longer. The rations themselves grew smaller. Bread turned into a thin, tasteless loaf that crumbled at the touch. Soup became hot water with a faint hint of vegetable. Sugar, butter, meat, these disappeared entirely. Starvation, once slow and creeping, sharpened into a brutal, daily force. Disease followed closely behind. Typhus spread in waves, fueled by lice and overcrowded conditions. Children developed fevers that burned through their small bodies. Adults grew so thin their bones pressed visibly against their skin. Hospitals overflowed with patients who lay to a bed or on floors, trembling under thin blankets. Doctors begged for medicine from the Germans. Their requests were ignored. The Germans allowed epidemic conditions to persist, using disease as another weapon, a way to weaken the population, a way to reduce the number of mouths needing food. Yet even as conditions worsened, German demands for labor increased. They needed workers to support the Eastern Front, workers to repair roads, build fortifications, produce uniforms. Jews who were strong enough were marched out daily, performing grueling tasks under constant threat. Those who stumbled were beaten. Those who collapsed were shot. The ghettos had always been centers of exploitation, but now the exploitation intensified. Work became even more closely tied to survival. And increasingly, even that wasn't enough. Something else began happening in 1941, something subtle at first, but unmistakably sinister. German authorities began experimenting with mass killing techniques. The Einsatzgruppen shootings were efficient in terms of ideology, but slow in terms of logistics. They required manpower, time, ammunition. The psychological toll on German soldiers, despite their indoctrination, led high-ranking officials to search for easier methods. And so the first gas vans were deployed, primarily at Chelmno. Jews were told they were being relocated. They were loaded into sealed trucks. The engines flooded the compartments with exhaust. When the trucks arrived at forest clearing sites, the doors opened to silent, lifeless bodies. These early experiments became the prototype for what would follow. Inside the ghettos, no one knew about gas vans yet, but they sensed a change in the way the language became more coded. Words like evacuation, resettlement, and special treatment appeared in orders. The atmosphere felt charged with unspoken intent. Some council members tried to decipher these terms, flipping through German regulations for clues. Others refused to believe they meant anything deadly. Denial became a coping mechanism. Hope, fragile and thin, kept people from collapsing under the weight of dread. In the streets, the ghetto population noticed another shift. The walls seemed to press in tighter. Patrols doubled. The German presence intensified. Curfews were reduced further. Shops that had limped along now shut completely. People whispered that the Germans were preparing something big. Children were told not to stray far. Adults avoided gathering in groups. Any sound at night, a truck engine, a boot scraping pavement, sent waves of fear through the households. The Judenrat faced the impossible task of maintaining order amidst escalating terror. Council members tried to reassure their communities, insisting that the worst rumors were untrue. They believed, or wanted to believe, that compliance could prolong life. They urged people to continue working, to maintain calm, to avoid provoking the Germans. But privately, council meetings grew darker, filled with anxious debates and hollow-eyed dread. They knew something was coming. They didn't know what, but they knew that the ghettos were no longer simply containment zones. They were becoming something else, something more dangerous. The Jewish police felt the shift acutely. German officers began issuing harsher commands, demanding more patrols, more reports, more control. The police understood that they were being prepared for a role they did not want, a role that would place them directly between the Germans and their own people. Many officers drank quietly in their homes at night, trying to numb the growing terror of what they might be forced to do. Some resigned, knowing refusal would lead to brutal punishment. Others applied for transfers they knew wouldn't be granted. Most stayed because their families depended on the protection their uniform offered. Outside the ghettos, as the war expanded eastward, German propaganda grew more violent. Posters and broadcasts spewed hatred, claiming that Jews were behind the Soviet resistance, that they were parasites, criminals, and enemies of the state. This propaganda wasn't merely public messaging. It was psychological conditioning, preparing German civilians, soldiers, and even administrators for the next phase of genocide. The hatred was being sharpened into a tool. The ghetto populations learned about massacres indirectly, from refugees fleeing eastern areas, from smuggled notes, from brief exchanges with laborers outside the walls. These stories were a Jewish laborer returned one day with shaking hands, telling his family that he had seen a ravine filled with bodies. A smuggler whispered that entire towns were gone. A doctor spoke quietly of a patient who had escaped a mass shooting by hiding under corpses. These accounts spread, sometimes dismissed as nightmares, sometimes believed fully. They added to the sense of dread settling like a fog over the ghettos. 1941 also saw the first large-scale actions, mass roundups within the ghettos. German soldiers stormed through streets, banging on doors, dragging people from their beds. They targeted the elderly, the sick, the homeless, anyone they deemed unproductive. People were forced into courtyards or empty lots, lined up, inspected. Some were shot on the spot. Others were taken away in trucks, never to return. These actions were precursors, tests. They showed the Germans how the population reacted, how the Judenrat complied, how the Jewish police enforced orders. They were rehearsals for liquidation. The emotional atmosphere inside the ghettos darkened. People could feel the walls closing in, not physically but psychologically. The uncertainty was torture. When would the next action occur? Who would be taken? What do the Germans want? The questions had no answers. Families lived with constant tension, sleeping in their clothes, hiding valuables in cracks in the walls or under floorboards. Some dug hiding places beneath their homes. Others prepared bags for emergency flight. But there was nowhere to go. The walls were high. The guards were armed. The population was trapped. As the autumn winds of 1941 swept through the ghettos, people began noticing a new phenomenon: empty spaces. Buildings that once housed dozens now stood silent. Streets felt less crowded. Courtyards seemed larger. The thinning of the population wasn't always from shootings or actions. Many died quietly, of hunger, of disease, of exhaustion. Their bodies were removed quickly, leaving behind vacant beds and vacant lives. The silence of those empty spaces felt louder than screams. In this same period, the Nazis began discussing a concept internally that would shape the future of every ghetto: the final solution. It wasn't formalized yet, not in written orders, but in conversations among high-ranking officials, in memos filled with coded language, in directives that hinted at complete removal. The outlines were forming. The ghettos were no longer temporary holding zones. They were the first stage in a process that would end in extermination. Yet the Jews inside the walls did not know this. They saw only the symptoms: increased brutality, increased restrictions, increased fear, but not the cause. They were trapped inside a puzzle whose pieces they could not assemble. As winter arrived at the end of 1941, the cold became another enemy. Frost crept across broken windows. People huddled under thin blankets, bodies pressed together for warmth. Fires burned in makeshift stoves, fueled by furniture, books, anything that could be sacrificed. The smoke mixed with the smell of illness and hunger, creating an atmosphere of choking despair. Workers trudged through snow, their breath forming brief clouds that dissolved into the frigid air. Their fingers stiffened. Their faces burned from the wind. Some collapsed on the way to labor sites. The Germans did not stop the march for them. The line continued forward, leaving dark shapes in the snow. And yet, in the midst of all this suffering, a new desperation took hold, something beyond hunger or fear. It was the realization that the old strategies of survival were no longer enough. Work permits, rations, compliance, obedience, none of these would protect them from what was coming next. The ghettos felt different now. Heavier, more dangerous, more final. Behind the walls, the population whispered the same question over and over. What are they preparing? The answer, carried secretly through German administrative networks, was the same everywhere. Transports. Not of workers. Not of families being relocated for labor. Transports of entire communities. The rails beyond the ghetto, once symbols of connection to the outside world, now took on a new meaning, one that filled every heart with dread. And, as 1941 drew to a close, the turn toward radicalization was complete. The Germans had shifted from containment to destruction, from control to eradication. The ghettos were no longer prisons. They were gateways, and the trains were coming. Chapter 7: Rumors of Death, Early Massacres, and Vanishing Transports. It begins with a scream that no one hears. A scream swallowed by trees, by soil, by the vast, indifferent sky above a forest clearing somewhere east of the ghetto. A young man, hands bound behind his back, kneels at the edge of a freshly dug pit. He feels the cold barrel of a rifle press against the back of his neck. He sucks in a final breath, the smell of damp leaves, mud, and gun oil. Then the world erupts in a flash he never sees. His body falls forward into darkness, into the mass of others already lying below. The pit shudders with the weight. A German officer wipes his gun, glances at his watch, and motions for the next group to step forward. It is efficient. It is silent. It is hidden from the world. And in the ghettos miles away, no one knows yet that the earth itself is filling with the dead. But some sense it. Somehow. Inside the ghettos, 1941 turns into 1942, with a tension so sharp it feels like the air itself might tear. People wake with a heaviness they can't explain. They walk through the narrow, overcrowded streets with their shoulders raised, expecting something to strike at any moment. Hunger gnaws at their insides, but fear gnaws deeper. The Germans are different now. Colder, quicker to violence, more secretive. Patrols move with a purpose no one can decode. German trucks idle in quiet corners before rumbling out of the ghetto gates at dawn, leaving behind only whispers. Something has changed. Something terrible. And then, the first stories begin to arrive. Broken pieces of truth carried by people who have seen what the ghetto residents have not. A smuggler returning from the countryside with sacks of potatoes he never delivers. He bursts into his apartment, pale, trembling, dumping the food onto the floor before collapsing. They killed them, he whispers to anyone who will listen. All of them. A whole village. Taken to the forest shot. He describes a trench, so long it disappears into the trees. He describes lines of families, children holding dolls, mothers clutching infants, all march toward the same direction. His voice cracks as he remembers the gunfire. He swears the earth moved afterward, as if the ground was trying to swallow the horror. People listen. Some believe him. Others shake their heads. It sounds impossible. It must be impossible. How can thousands be killed in a single day? How can an entire town disappear? Surely he's exaggerating. Surely trauma has twisted his memory. But the rumors don't stop. A laborer returning from a work detail outside the ghetto describes something even more terrifying. A ravine near Kiev, bodies piled on bodies, the air thick with the smell of smoke and blood. He says the Germans forced Jews to undress before shooting them, that their clothes were sorted afterward like second-hand goods. He says the soldiers joked as they reloaded their rifles. It is called Babi Yar, he whispers, his voice barely audible. No one survived. His listeners lean in, their hands gripping his arms. How many? They ask. He shakes his head. Too many to count. Word spreads quickly, slipping through the ghetto like a cold wind. People gather in tight clusters, whispering in doorways, stairwells, alleys. Some are furious, calling the stories lies designed to spread panic. Others fall silent, unable to dismiss the dread that freezes their hearts. Children listen too, their wide eyes absorbing every detail, even though their parents try to shoo them away. In the offices of the Jewish councils, the rumors strike like blows. Council members sit in dim rooms, flickering candles illuminating their exhausted faces. They discuss what they've heard, passing information like contraband. Someone reports that all Jews from a nearby town were loaded into trucks and vanished. Another claims that a train full of deportees never reached its supposed destination. A third mentions a German officer who laughed drunkenly during a patrol and said, "You won't be here long." No one knows what any of it means, but all feel the weight of a truth forming, something dark rising beneath their feet. Then something happens that shatters whatever denial remains. Something no one can ignore. People begin to disappear. At first, it's small groups. 10 here, 20 there, selected by German officers during the early morning hours. A list is delivered to the Jewish police, who obey the order trembling. Families are woken by heavy fists pounding on doors. Mothers plead. Fathers argue. Children cry. But the Germans are unmoved. They pull people from their beds, sometimes giving them minutes to gather belongings, sometimes giving no time at all. They are marched out of the ghetto under armed guard, their footsteps echoing against the walls. No one knows where they are going. By afternoon, the empty rooms left behind seem to echo with ghosts. Neighbors stare at the open doorways, the abandoned shoes, the blankets still warm. Resettlement, the Germans say. Work camps, agricultural labor. But the people taken leave behind no letters, no messages, no signs of life. It's as if they've vanished into thin air. Whispers grow louder. No one ever returns. The transports go east. There are no labor camps east. They're killing them. Still, many refuse to believe it. They cling to hope because hope is all they have. They point to the German need for labor. Why kill workers, they ask. They argue that the Germans want productivity, not corpses. But in dark corners, others shake their heads. We are not workers, they say. We are not people to them. We are numbers. We are By spring of 1942, the rumors take on a new form. Rumors not only of massacres, but of mechanization. A merchant returning from outside the ghetto claims he saw a truck filled with people drive into the forest, but when it returned the windows were fogged from inside with condensation. The driver laughed and slapped the side of the truck as if patting a faithful animal. The engine does the work, he said to someone standing nearby. Inside the ghetto, this story spreads like wildfire. A truck that kills? A vehicle that suffocates passengers with exhaust? People argue bitterly over whether this is even possible. Some laugh nervously. Others cover their mouths to hide their terror. And still, more transports leave the ghetto. More families vanish. More rooms stand empty. People begin marking the dates on scraps of paper. 30 taken from Block 12. 50 taken from Croque Malna Street. 100 lined up near the hospital. These notes form patterns. Patterns form understanding. Understanding forms terror. The rumors no longer come only from smugglers and laborers. They come from the Germans themselves. Careless words overheard in bars, in patrol conversations, through thin apartment walls. A soldier says, "They won't be around long." Another jokes, "Soon the ghetto will be clean." A third mutters, "The east is being cleared." Every sentence fuels the fire. In some ghettos, brave individuals try to gather concrete information. Underground newspapers emerge, handwritten, printed secretly, distributed in tiny quantities. These papers describe mass graves in Latvia, shootings in Lithuania, forests in Belarus filled with the dead. They piece together fragments of truth and publish them not to spread panic, but to warn. Yet even these reports feel impossible. How can anyone process the idea of thousands killed in a single day? How can the human mind grasp pits filled with bodies? How can one believe such horror when one has never seen anything like it before? And then something happens that makes belief unavoidable. A transport returns, but not with people. A wagon loaded with belongings, clothing, shoes, children's toys, coats, the possessions of those taken in an earlier action. They arrive in bundles, sometimes stained, sometimes torn. German officers unload them and sort them in warehouses. Some items are sent back into the ghetto for redistribution. Others are sent to Germany for reuse. People watch as a neighbor's coat is placed on a table, still smelling faintly of her perfume. The message is clear. The owners of these belongings are gone. Not resettled. Not working. Gone. In the streets, an eerie silence settles. Even the children feel it. Even the dogs sense it. Something enormous and deadly is moving closer. The Judenrat tries to reason with the Germans, to ask for explanations. They receive none. German officers simply say, "Orders." The council members return to their offices looking as if they've aged 10 years in a week. They begin to understand a truth they cannot say aloud. They are not administrators. They are caretakers of a population marked for destruction. Meanwhile, inside the ghetto walls, the population begins preparing in their own way, not for deportation, but for hiding. Families dig holes beneath floorboards. They build false walls behind cupboards. They construct bunkers under staircases. They place mattresses over trapdoors. They stockpile crumbs of bread, bits of dried fruit, jars of pickled vegetables. They whisper instructions to their children. If the soldiers come, run here. If we get separated, hide in this corner. Don't make noise. Their hands tremble as they create these hiding spaces, knowing that they are not safety. They are temporary illusions. By the end of 1941 and early 1942, rumors evolve from shadows into something sharper, something closer to truth. Stories circulate of camps being built with strange structures resembling shower rooms. Stories of chimneys that burn day and night. Stories of fences topped with electricity. Stories of entire transports entering, and only one train returning empty. People begin using a new word in hushed tones: extermination. No one wants to believe it, but the pattern is undeniable. The Germans push for more detailed population records. They demand lists of those unable to work. They order the Judenrat to prepare family registers. They stockpile supplies near train stations. They expand railway lines. They construct loading platforms. The ghettos, once thought to be temporary prisons, now feel like waiting rooms for something far darker. And then, the clearest sign emerges. The Germans forbid funerals. Not officially, not through a proclamation, but through soldiers who interrupt burial processions, who dismantle makeshift cemeteries, who mock grieving families by saying, "Save your tears. You'll need them." The message is unmistakable. They expect death. They expect mass death. Soon, inside the ghetto, every conversation becomes a negotiation with dread. People ask each other the same questions. What happens when the next transport leaves? Why do they need so many lists? Why do they say no one is coming back? What is happening in the forests? What are they doing in those camps? But the most terrifying question is the one no one wants to ask. When will it be our turn? Still, the ghettos cling to life. Children continue to learn in secret classrooms. Musicians gather in hidden corners to play soft melodies. Rabbis whisper prayers even as their voices tremble. Couples marry in dimly lit rooms, exchanging vows they know they may not live to fulfill. Parents tell bedtime stories to children who fall asleep clutching their arms tightly. This is not denial. This is resistance. The human spirit refusing to collapse entirely under the weight of fear. But the fear grows. It grows each time a truck idles near the ghetto gate. Each time a German soldier smiles strangely. Each time a name is called from a list. Each time a room is left empty. Vanishing becomes the new reality. And the most horrifying part is this. The people inside the ghettos still cannot imagine the scale of what is coming. They can grasp murder. They can grasp massacre. But they cannot yet grasp industrial extermination. The idea of killing entire populations systematically, efficiently, mechanically, That idea lies outside human comprehension. But the Germans can imagine it. They are already planning it. They are building it. The ghettos think the worst has happened. They are wrong. Because soon, the rumors will end. Not because the truth becomes clearer, but because the truth will arrive at their doorstep, carried on steel rails, in the form of trains built not for travel, but for death. The earth outside the ghetto is already full. But the Germans are preparing new methods. More silent, more efficient, more final. And as the whispers continue to circulate through the narrow alleys and overcrowded rooms, the people inside the ghettos fight to hold on to hope, unaware that the next chapter of their lives will begin with the sound of a whistle, a sound far more deadly than the scream that began this one. Chapter 8. The Wannsee Conference. Bureaucracy of Murder, January 1942. It begins in a room that looks too ordinary for the weight it carries. A lake lies frozen outside, its surface pale and still beneath the gray January sky. A villa stands on the shore, quiet, elegant, almost serene. Its windows reflect the cold light, hiding everything happening within. Inside, a long wooden table gleams under polished fixtures. Chairs are arranged neatly. Carafes of wine and trays of food sit ready, as though this were a gathering of businessmen, not architects of genocide. One by one, men in crisp uniforms and tailored suits step through the doorway, shaking snow from their coats, greeting each other with polite nods. They speak softly, almost casually, as they take their seats. None of them raises his voice. None of them flinches. And as the door closes behind the last arrival, the room seals itself off from the world. This is Wannsee, and in the next 90 minutes, these men will turn scattered violence and chaotic terror into something organized, systematic, and horrifyingly efficient. But the people inside the ghettos hundreds of kilometers away have no idea this meeting is happening. They know only the hunger, the rumors, the disappearances. They know the Germans speak in codes, hide their intentions, deliver orders with masks of professionalism. They know that violence has escalated since the invasion of the Soviet Union, that massacres in forests and ravines have wiped out entire communities. But they still believe, because they must, that perhaps these horrors are exceptions, not plans. They cling to scraps of hope, because hope is the only warmth left in the freezing winter of 1942. If they could see inside that villa, their hope would shatter instantly. Reinhard Hader presides over the meeting. Tall, composed, almost graceful in his precision, he moves through the room with quiet authority. His eyes hold a coldness that does not waver. He is not a man wrestling with moral dilemmas. He is a man executing a vision. His deputy, Adolf Eichmann, stands nearby with documents, spreadsheets of death, charts of population breakdowns, schedules of logistics. Eichmann's handwriting fills the margins with notes so precise they resemble the workings of an accountant preparing year-end statements. But these numbers aren't profits or losses. They are human beings, millions of them, categorized not by worth, but by how quickly and efficiently they can be removed from existence. The villa is warm inside. A fire crackles on the hearth. The men sip cognac. Snow falls gently outside. Nothing in the atmosphere matches the horror of the discussion. And that mismatch, the calmness of the setting and the brutality of the subject, is what makes Wannsee so terrifying. Genocide is not being discussed with rage or violence. It is being planned like a public works project, like a budget allocation, like a transportation plan. Heydrich begins the meeting by stating its purpose: coordination. The killing has already begun. Mass shootings, gas vans, starvation, disease. But the methods are inconsistent. Some regions are too slow. Some commanders lack clarity. Some German agencies overlap in authority. Wannsee's goal is to fix these inefficiencies by unifying every arm of the German state behind a single vision: the complete annihilation of Europe's Jews. He speaks calmly, formally, as though he were presenting a plan for reorganizing schools or factories. Eichmann distributes documents listing Jewish populations across Europe, country by country, region by region. Millions of names compressed into tidy rows of numbers. The men around the table lean forward, scanning the lists with interest. They point to territories. They discuss logistics, transportation routes, labor availability. They debate the definitions of full Jew, half Jew, quarter Jew. The language is clinical, detached. They're not talking about families. They're talking about categories. Inside the ghettos, families huddle around small makeshift stoves, trying to warm their hands over weak flames. They are unaware that at this exact moment, German officials are debating how to count them, how to classify them, how to destroy them. Children in the ghettos curl against their mothers' sides, drifting into restless sleep with empty stomachs. They do not know that men with polished boots and clean uniforms are assigning them to columns in a spreadsheet. Heydrich outlines the plan with chilling clarity. Jews will be deported to the east. Some will be worked to death. The rest will be treated appropriately. A phrase so vague that for a moment the room is quiet, as if its meaning hovers in the air waiting to be acknowledged. Heydrich then clarifies it. Treated appropriately means killed. Efficiently. Systematically. Without chaos. Without waste. The men nod. No one gasps. No one protests. No one questions the morality. They debate implementation, not ethics. Meanwhile, in the ghettos, winter tightens its grip. People cough through the night, their bodies shivering beneath threadbare blankets. The cold creeps under doors, through cracks in walls, into bones already weakened by hunger. Parents melt ice to drink. Children lick frost from windowsills. Sickness spreads like wildfire through overcrowded rooms. The ghettos believe they are suffering the worst moment of their lives, but they are wrong. The worst is being organized inside a villa by a lake. Back at Wannsee, the discussion shifts to logistics, the heart of any industrial project. Transports will depart regularly, carrying thousands at a time. Rail schedules must be adjusted. Local authorities must coordinate. The SS will oversee the entire operation. Efficiency is key. The industrial mindset takes over the room. Problems, solutions, projected timelines, potential obstacles. Obstacles like resistance, too small to worry about. Obstacles like how ordinary Germans will react, already handled through propaganda and silence. Obstacles like international attention, minimal. No one is coming to save the Jews. Heydrich's voice remains steady as he explains that Jews will first be separated by ability. Those deemed strong enough will be used. Their labor will serve the German war effort until their bodies collapse. The others, the elderly, the sick, the very young, will be dealt with immediately. The men nod again. One asks whether this method might cause emotional strain on personnel. Heydrich answers calmly. New facilities are being constructed. Their efficiency will minimize such concerns. Gas chambers, crematoria, places designed so that German soldiers never have to look their victims in the eyes. In the ghettos, people have no idea that such facilities exist. They hear rumors of camps, but imagine labor battalions, not gas chambers. They cannot imagine industrial death because nothing in human history has prepared them for it. They think that deportation might be a chance at survival. Some imagine farms. Some imagine factories. Some imagine that at least life outside the ghetto must be better than this living tomb. If they knew the truth being finalized at Wannsee, they would cling to the ghetto walls with their bare hands and never let go. One of the men at the meeting raises a concern. What a public perception, he asks. Heydrich reassures him. The process will be conducted discreetly. The Eastern territories are vast. The local populations are frightened. The rail system is already controlled by the Reich. And anyway, he adds, the war will obscure everything. No one will notice, he says. And if they notice, they will not act. The room relaxes. In the ghettos, mothers whisper bedtime stories to their children, trying to distract them from the pain in their stomachs. Fathers try to carve toys from scraps of wood. Teachers gather children in secret classes to recite poetry or arithmetic. People cling to their humanity as tightly as they can, unaware that it is being discussed like a logistical inconvenience. A councilman at the villa asks a question that pierces through the bureaucratic monotony. What the older Jews? Heydrich responds without hesitation. They will be dealt with appropriately. Another man suggests sterilization for some categories. Heydrich waves him off. Too slow, he says. Too inefficient. The goal is not control. It is elimination. Across continents. Across language. Across history. The fireplace crackles. Snow falls softly outside. Inside, the final solution takes shape. When the meeting ends, the men stand, stretch, adjust their coats. They drink another round of cognac. They chat about the cold weather, about their families, about travel plans. They step outside into the crisp winter air, feeling refreshed, invigorated. Cars arrive. Drivers salute. Engines hum. The villa empties. Within minutes, the room is silent again. The table stands untouched, the documents tucked away. The decisions made here will ripple outward, unseen by the world, until they reach every ghetto, every town, every hiding place. Inside the ghettos, the next few weeks feel strangely calm. No official announcements are made. People cling to this quiet as a sign that perhaps things are stabilizing. But beneath the surface, the machinery set in motion at Wannsee begins to turn. Rail lines are cleared. Orders are drafted. Camps expand. Construction accelerates. Trucks deliver supplies to places no one in the ghettos knows exist. The first major deportations are just months away. But before they come, another shift occurs, one that prepares the ghettos for their transformation from prisons to departure points. The Germans introduce new work categories. They adjust ration allocations. They reorganize streets to create more efficient routes. They measure distances between each ghetto and the nearest rail station. They conduct more actions, selecting the weak, the old, the unwanted. These actions are not random. They are tests, experiments to refine the process. People in the ghettos feel the tightening. Patrols grow harsher. German officers speak in clipped tones. The Judenrat receives new forms, new demands, new instructions that make no sense. The Jewish police are pressured to increase patrols. No one knows why, but everyone feels the dread sharpening. Rumors accelerate. More towns in the east are emptied. More trains leave other ghettos without returning. More smuggled notes report chimneys smoking day and night near places called Belzec, Chelmno, Sobibor. Names that mean nothing yet. Names that will soon become synonymous with death. The shift becomes impossible to ignore when, on a cold morning, German officers begin marking houses. Not with names, not with numbers, with letters. Letters that no one understands, but everyone fears. People paint over the marks. The Germans repaint them. The message is unmistakable. You are being sorted. The Judenrat tries to plead for information. They receive nothing but silence. The Jewish police ask for clarification. They receive nothing but orders. The ghetto population asks questions. They receive nothing but dread. And still, inside the ghettos, people cling to hope. Hope that their labor matters. Hope that their children will survive. Hope that the rumors of death are exaggerations. Hope that the Germans will deport them to farms, not kill them. Hope that the nightmare will end soon. But the decisions made at Wannsee ensure that the nightmare is only beginning. The ghettos are no longer containment zones, no longer forced labor centers. They are reservoirs waiting to be drained. Their populations are now categorized, quantified, scheduled. The men at Wannsee have done their work well. The rails are being prepared. The trains are warming. The next phase of genocide is about to begin. And inside the ghettos, as the snow melts and spring approaches, the people sense a shift but do not grasp its magnitude. They see only the signs: increased German presence, new orders, more lists, more disappearances. But they cannot yet see the full picture, the picture drawn in ink at a villa by a lake, where genocide was organized over drinks and polite conversation. That picture will reveal itself soon. It will arrive with whistles, with orders shouted at dawn, with families torn from beds, with the gates opening not to life, but to tracks stretching eastward. Wannsee has set everything in motion. and the ghettos will feel its impact in the most devastating way imaginable. Chapter 9. Operation Reinhard begins. Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. It begins with a lie so simple, so ordinary, that it almost feels harmless. A German officer stands before a crowd in the ghetto square, his voice calm, rehearsed, almost polite. He tells the people gathered there that they're being resettled for work. He assures them that their families will stay together. He claims that conditions will be better. Behind him, trucks rumble quietly. Behind them, soldiers stand with rifles resting on their shoulders. The officer's voice carries over the cold morning air, smoothing over the tension with practiced confidence. And for a moment, one brief, fragile moment, some people want to believe him. They want to trust the softness of his tone, the simplicity of his words, the possibility that the nightmare of the ghetto may finally be ending. But deep inside, beneath layers of hunger and fear, something breaks. A mother grips her daughter's hand a little tighter. A father glances at the armed men and feels dread twist in his stomach. A child watches the trucks and senses danger without understanding why. The lie lingers in the air like smoke, and its purpose is clear: to make people walk willingly toward death. Operation Reinhard has begun. Reinhard Heydrich's assassination months later would give the operation its name, but the machinery of death was already in motion long before he fell. The decision made at Wannsee to annihilate Europe's Jews required more than shootings or starvation. It required industrial solutions, fixed locations, predictable schedules, rail access, facilities designed from the ground up for extermination and nothing else. And so, in late 1941 and early 1942, the Germans began constructing a network of killing sites unlike anything the world had ever seen. The first was Chelmno. At Chelmno, the Germans tested the idea that killing could be mobile, mechanical, quiet. Gas vans became the prototype tools of genocide. They were ordinary-looking trucks with sealed compartments. Jews were told they were being transported to another location. They stepped inside willingly, clutching bags or blankets. The door slammed. The driver started the engine. Exhaust from the motor was pumped directly into the compartment. Within minutes, the pounding of fists against metal grew weak. Minutes later, silence. The truck drove to a forest clearing, where bodies were dumped into pits. The process was grotesque, but it taught the Nazis something. Centralized facilities would be more efficient. Vented gas chambers, fixed routes, larger scales. In the ghettos, people heard whispers of Chelmno. They heard of trucks that returned empty, of forests where the earth had been churned, of a place where no one came back alive. But the rumors felt too monstrous to be real. Even in their suffering, even in their fear, the mind recoiled at the idea of murder on such a scale. But Chelmno was only the beginning. Belzec came next. Belzec was designed with precision and malice. Its architects studied how long it took for a body to collapse under carbon monoxide. They experimented with chamber sizes. They adjusted the layout so that victims would move efficiently from arrival platforms to undressing areas to gas chambers. Every detail was engineered like a railway terminal. Even the paths were curved so that new arrivals could not see what awaited them ahead. Inside Belzec's gas chambers, the air was thick with the scent of metal and sweat. The chambers were small, claustrophobic, lined with wooden boards to dampen sound. Guards forced people inside, men, women, children, pushing them so tightly that they could barely move. Then the door slammed shut. A generator pumped carbon monoxide from a motor engine into the sealed rooms. People clawed at the walls. They pushed against each other. They screamed for air. Within 30 minutes, the chambers fell silent. The doors opened. Bodies tumbled out, limbs twisted, faces frozen in terror. Workers, Jewish prisoners forced into service, dragged the corpses to pits. The ground at Belzec became soaked with blood and decay. Meanwhile, in the ghettos, life narrowed to a single instinct: survival. But survival without understanding was a cruel illusion. People still believed resettlement was possible. They believed the trains might take them somewhere livable. They believed their children might grow up. They believed because belief was the only thing that kept despair from crushing them. Then came Sobibor. Sobibor was built deeper in the forests, its trees acting as walls, concealing its true purpose from anyone passing by. But inside the camp, the atmosphere was worse than anything imaginable. The air smelled of sap and soil mixed with the stench of burning flesh. Birds disappeared from the area, sensing danger. The ground vibrated with the constant movement of bodies, carts, and machinery. Sobibor was designed to kill quickly, efficiently, without pause. Its gas chambers were disguised as shower rooms. Water pipes lined the walls to maintain the illusion. But no water ever flowed. Trains arrived constantly. People stepped onto the platform, disoriented after hours or days of suffocating transport. They were greeted by SS officers who assured them that they were at a transit station. A man in a white coat, pretending to be a doctor, would sometimes walk along the line, giving false instructions. The deception was total. People clung to it. They wanted to believe the nightmare was temporary. But the path from the platform to the gas chambers was called the tube, a fenced corridor screened with branches so victims could not see the buildings ahead. Guards beat anyone who slowed down. At the end of the tube stood the gas chambers. Within an hour of arrival, entire transports disappeared. Treblinka followed, and with it, death reached its most systematic form. Treblinka was the deadliest of all Reinhard camps, killing hundreds of thousands with a speed that defied understanding. It operated like a factory. Trains arrived every day. German officers conducted selections only to maintain the illusion of order. The elderly, the sick, children, anyone deemed unfit, were sent directly to the gas chambers. Those considered strong enough were kept alive for a few days or weeks to sort belongings, clean chambers, bury bodies. But no one survived long. Treblinka was not a labor camp. It was a death machine. From the moment a person stepped off the train, their fate was sealed. Guards shouted, dogs barked, the air filled with panic and confusion. Victims were forced to undress in a large square. Their clothes were collected and sorted. Valuables were seized. Some women's hair was cut. All of this was done with the same mechanical precision seen in factories, except the product was death. The gas chambers at Treblinka were larger, designed to kill more people at once. Carbon monoxide from large engines flooded the rooms. Workers held back the doors as victims inside struggled in their final moments. When the noise stopped, the doors opened. Bodies spilled out like a wave. The workers dragged them to pits or, later, cremation sites. The smell of burning flesh hung over the camp day and night, carried for miles by the wind. Even German soldiers complained about it. Inside the ghettos, the rumors became harder to ignore. People spoke of camps where no letters came from, no survivors escaped. They heard of rail lines that local villagers avoided because of the screams. They heard of chimneys that belched smoke constantly. They heard of ashes falling from the sky like dark snow. But denial remained, even in the face of terror. Hope is stubborn. Hope survives even when logic dies. Parents told their children to pack warm clothes, just in case. Neighbors exchanged theories about new settlements. Rabbis searched scriptures for meaning. People clung to the idea that life, some life, awaited them. Operation Reinhard shattered those illusions one transport at a time. The Germans now saw the ghettos as reservoirs to be emptied. Their population numbers, once used for rationing or labor assignments, became logistics numbers. Numbers for train capacity, numbers for camp throughput, numbers for how many bodies the pits could contain before burning was required. Numbers that separated humanity into categories of expendability. Inside the ghettos, German patrols increased. Streets were cleared. Houses were marked. Lists were updated. The pressure became unbearable. People slept in their clothes, ready to run. Families built bunkers. Smugglers scouted hiding places. The Judenrat tried desperately to negotiate labor exemptions, family exemptions, any exemptions, but the Germans were no longer interested. They no longer needed labor. They needed bodies. Trains began arriving near the ghettos like clockwork. Their engines hissed. Their whistles echoed through the night. Their doors clanged open with metallic finality. German officers shouted orders. Faster! Leave your belongings. Children first. The narrow streets filled with panic as people were pushed toward the station. Some resisted. Some begged. Some collapsed. Some tried to hide and were dragged out. The deportations became operations of terror. Efficient, brutal, relentless. The trains themselves were instruments of torment. Cattle cars with no seats, no windows, no air. People crammed inside so tightly they cannot sit. Babies suffocated. Elderly people collapsed. The heat grew unbearable. The cold froze fingers. The smell of sweat, urine, and fear turned the air toxic. Hours passed. Days passed. The cries slowly faded. Inside the ghettos, those left behind lived with the knowledge that their turn was coming. They watched the trains depart with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Some stood frozen, unable to move. Others fled to hiding places, trembling in the dark. Mothers pressed their children to their chests, whispering prayers. But the ghettos were being emptied, bit by bit, street by street, block by block. In some places, resistance emerged. Small groups formed, gathering weapons, planning uprisings. But they were few, and the German war machine was vast. The ghettos were starved into submission, weakened by labor, crushed by disease. And now, under the shadow of Operation Reinhard, they were being erased. Everywhere, the same pattern unfolded. A German officer announced resettlement. Families were gathered. The weak were shot. The rest were herded to trains. The trains went east. No one returned. Those who worked inside the death camps, prisoners forced into service, learned the truth with horrifying clarity. They saw the piles of shoes, the mounds of hair, the discarded toys, the suitcases still labeled with names of people who believed they would reclaim them. They saw the bodies, thousands of them, tens of thousands. They saw the faces twisted in final terror. They saw the hands reaching for air. They saw the impossible scale of the machinery. And they understood the Nazis were not killing a town or a region or a group. They were killing a people. Operation Reinhard became the deadliest phase of the Holocaust. Within just months, hundreds of thousands, entire ghettos worth of families, were gone, vanished, consumed by the machinery built for annihilation. Inside the ghettos that still existed, the silence became unbearable. Streets once overcrowded grew empty. Buildings once full of noise fell quiet. Those left alive looked around and realized that survival had changed meaning. It was no longer a matter of finding food or avoiding disease. It was now a matter of escaping a system designed to eliminate them entirely. Operation Reinhard had turned the ghettos into gateways to death. And as the trains continued to roll, as the camps expanded, as the chimneys burned without cease, one truth became unmistakable. The Germans were no longer hiding what they planned. They were doing it openly. They were doing it proudly. They were doing it with efficiency, so ruthless it felt mechanical. The ghettos had entered their final phase, and the next chapter would be even more devastating. Because Operation Reinhard did not end with death camps. It ended with liquidations, complete destruction, and soon, the last remnants of Jewish life in the ghettos would be swept away, leaving only ashes, silence, and the distant hiss of trains disappearing. Chapter 10. Liquidations. The systematic emptying of ghettos, 1942 to 1943. It begins with footsteps, slow at first, like distant thunder rolling across stone. Then louder, sharper, synchronized. Boots, dozens of them, moving through the pre-dawn darkness. In a cramped apartment inside the Warsaw Ghetto, a woman wakes with a start. She hears the sound and feels her stomach clench. This is not the shuffle of starving residents searching for water, not the footsteps of Jewish police on night patrol. These steps are heavier, intentional, final. She looks at her sleeping children, their faces hollow, their limbs thin as twigs, and she knows, without being told, that the moment everyone feared has come. The Germans are here. The action has begun. And today, her street will be emptied. Across occupied Poland, across every corner of the Nazi-controlled territories, the liquidations follow the same pattern: precise, cruel, rehearsed. The Nazis don't improvise. They don't hesitate. Each ghetto, no matter its size, no matter how long it existed, no matter how many lives struggled within its walls, is targeted with the efficiency of a machine flipping a switch. One day, the ghetto is overcrowded with the sound of coughing, crying, bargaining, praying. The next day, it is silent. The liquidation of the ghettos is not a single event, but a campaign, a coordinated wave of destruction that sweeps from one city to another like a cold, methodical storm. Warsaw, Krakow, Lublin, Białystok, Vilna, Grodno, Lodz, Tarnow. The list is endless. Each name represents thousands of families, thousands of lives, thousands of stories abruptly cut short. The first sign is always the same. The gates slam shut. German soldiers surround the perimeter, rifles loaded, dogs barking, searchlights slicing through the cold morning air. The Jewish police, forced into position by German orders, stand trembling near the entry points, their faces pale with dread. They know what is coming. They know the Germans expect obedience. They know that if they do not help, their families will be targeted first. Inside the ghetto, chaos erupts in waves. People run to hide in basements, attics, false walls. Parents stuff children into cupboards and crawl spaces, whispering, "Don't move. Don't make a sound." Others bundle whatever food they have, preparing to flee or bargain. Some stand frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The fear is total. It has a taste, metallic, bitter, unforgettable. German soldiers fan out. They beat down doors with rifle butts, shouting commands. Raus! Schnell! Out! Faster! Their voices echo up stairwells, across courtyards, through walls. Families stumble into the streets half-dressed, clutching blankets, carrying small bundles of belongings. The soldiers shout again, "Only take what you can carry." A lie. Nothing will matter where they're going. Those who resist are beaten. Those who fall are shot. A German officer sees an old man struggling to walk and casually raises his pistol. A single gunshot cracks through the air. The man collapses. No one dares to look. Death is expected, almost routine. But the shock never fades. The deportation point, usually a train station, railway siding, or open square, fills rapidly. Thousands packed together shoulder to shoulder, the smell of sweat and fear mixing with smoke from soldier cigarettes. Children cry. Mothers hush them. Fathers look at the sky, trying to hide their shaking hands. The German officers move through the crowd with clipboards, checking lists, shouting numbers, dividing people into groups. This is where the first selection occurs. To the left, those still considered fit for work. Mostly young men, some young women, a few strong adults in their 40s or 50s. They are told they will be sent to labor camps. To the right, everyone else. The elderly, the sick, the weak, pregnant women, mothers with young children, anyone injured, anyone too thin, anyone whose age makes them useless to the Nazi machine. A mother stands in line, clutching her small son. A German officer looks at her, then at the boy. He points to the right. She shakes her head, begs him to reconsider. He points again, until two soldiers pull her away. Her son screams. In desperation, she tries to reach him, but she is beaten to the ground. The boy is carried away by a soldier who looks bored by the entire scene. This is liquidation. Where these people are sent is no longer a secret, at least not to the Nazis. The right-hand line leads to death camps built under Operation Reinhardt. Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. The trains are waiting. The doors are open. Inside the ghettos, still awaiting liquidation, people whisper urgently in every corner. They've heard the rumors about chimneys that burn day and night, about ash floating in the air, about trains that go east and return empty. They whisper about villages that have vanished overnight. They whisper about pits filled with bodies. They whisper about hell. And yet, they still hope. They try to believe there is work ahead. They try to believe the Germans need them alive. They cling to any possibility of survival because the alternative is too horrible to accept. But liquidation crushes hope with brutal finality. In Krakow, the Germans drag people from their homes and assemble them in the Podgor Square. Children are thrown onto carts like luggage. German officers walk through the crowd, selecting who will live and who will die with shocking indifference, pointing, shrugging, tallying. They shoot anyone who cries too loudly. They shoot anyone who... In Lublin, the liquidation begins before dawn. People are pulled from their homes and marched to the train station. The elderly fall on the icy streets. Soldiers shoot them where they lie. Others collapse from hunger or exhaustion. Their bodies are dragged to the side of the road, left in piles. The remaining prisoners are packed in trains so tightly that no one can move. Babies suffocate in their mother's arms. Adults faint standing upright. The air becomes unbreathable. In Białystok, panic spreads when people hear gunfire outside the ghetto walls. German soldiers storm through the gates, firing into crowds. Smoke from burning buildings fills the air, stinging eyes, choking lungs. Families flee toward hiding places, but soldiers find them all. The resistance fights back in some areas, but they are vastly outnumbered. Entire blocks are set ablaze. Screams echo through the streets. In smaller ghettos, the scenes are just as horrifying. The Germans liquidate them entirely in a single day. In towns like Otwock, Radom, Piotrkow, and Tarnow, the same pattern unfolds. Roundups, shootings, deportations, empty streets. Some ghettos are given false instructions the night before. German officers post notices claiming that all residents must report for registration. Others announce new work assignments. Some even promise increased rations for those who appear at the assembly point. These lies ensure the crowds arrive willingly. In Warsaw, the liquidation begins in July 1942. German trucks rumble through the ghetto every morning. Thousands are forced into the Umschlagplatz, the holding area for deportations. Day after day, the trains leave for Treblinka. Day after day, families vanish. Within 2 months, more than 250,000 Jews are removed. 250,000 people erased. In the chaos, people attempt to save their children. Mothers push babies into strangers' arms. Fathers beg the Jewish police to let their sons slip into work lines. Women hide infants in sacks of laundry. Some push children through cracks in the ghetto walls. Some hide them under floorboards. Some hand them to passing nuns. The air fills with desperate pleas. Take my child. Save her, please. He is all I have. Don't let them take her. Liquidation is not just murder. It is the destruction of families, of humanity, of dignity. Resistance emerges in sparks, small, fierce flames against an enormous storm. In some ghettos, prisoners fight back with smuggled guns, homemade explosives, or sheer determination. In others, they refuse to assemble, forcing the Germans to drag them out by force. But resistance is always met with overwhelming retaliation. Buildings are torched. Streets are filled with bullets. Entire families are executed as punishment. In Vilna, young fighters whisper a message that becomes a rallying cry. Let's not go like sheep to the slaughter. They form plans to escape into forests. Some succeed. Most do not. In the ghettos still standing, the emptiness left by liquidation is palpable. Streets once overcrowded now lie silent. Buildings stand with broken windows, doors hanging open, floors covered in discarded belongings. The air feels heavier, as if it carries the weight of thousands of souls who pass through it in their final moments. People who survive the liquidation of their ghetto often find themselves alone. Entire neighborhoods are gone. Entire families gone. Entire generations gone. The Judenrat is dissolved. The Jewish police are executed or deported. Administration offices are abandoned. The ghettos become ghost towns. For those forced onto the trains, the nightmare continues in the darkness of the cattle cars. The smell of excrement, sweat, and death suffocates them. Children cry until their voices fade. Adults collapse from lack of air. Some claw at the wooden slats, trying to breathe. Others pray. Many go silent. When the doors finally open, the sunlight blinds them. The ground beneath their feet is unfamiliar. The air smells strange, sweet, acrid, smoky. SS officers shout orders. Dogs bark. Guards beat anyone who hesitates. People stumble forward, dizzy, disoriented, holding onto each other. And then they see it. The long, low buildings disguised as bathhouses. The chimneys rising above them. The smoke curling upward. They smell burned flesh. They hear screams from inside walls that look too thin to contain them. The truth hits them instantly. Others understand only when forced to undress. Still others cling to false hope until the gas chamber door slams shut. Liquidation ends life, not only physically, but psychologically. It crushes faith. It destroys identity. It ends stories mid-sentence. When the Warsaw Ghetto is almost empty, German soldiers walk through the streets, setting fire to buildings, destroying evidence. Flames curl up stairwells, swallowing apartments where families once lived. Smoke thickens, smothering the air. The ghetto burns for days. Those who hid in attics or cellars suffocate or are dragged out and shot. The fire becomes the final stage of liquidation, erasing the place itself. In Krakow, the same fate awaits. Nearly all its Jews deported, the ghetto walls torn down afterward. In Lublin, Majdanek becomes the destination. In Białystok, Treblinka. In countless other cities, the pattern repeats. Those not shot on the spot are sent to death camps. Liquidation transforms entire regions into graveyards. Inside the ghettos that still remain, people live with unbearable fear. They know what comes next. They hear the stories. They see the emptiness in other cities. They know the trains will arrive soon. Some try to prepare. They dig deeper hiding places. They gather food. They teach their children how to stay silent for hours. They swear not to surrender. Others lose hope entirely. The strain of survival breaks them. They sit quietly in corners, waiting. And then, the day comes. No ghetto is spared. Liquidation is total. The Germans arrive with lists, with guns, with trucks. The streets fill with screams. The trains wait with open doors. And another fragment of Jewish life, another community, another neighborhood, another culture, is erased. In the end, liquidation is not just a military operation. It is a methodical disassembly of a people, a slow tearing apart of families, of identity, of memory. The ghettos, once crowded with suffering, become empty spaces echoing with silence. And the survivors, those few who escape, who hide, who fight, carry with them the weight of everything they saw, everything they lost. Because liquidation is not only about killing. It is about wiping lives from the map. And the next phase, transportation to camps, is even worse. For the trains are ready. The tracks are clear. And the Nazis now turn toward the final step in their plan, the complete removal of every remaining Jew. Chapter 11, Trains of Death, Deportation Machinery, and the Logistics of Killing. It begins with a whistle, shrill, metallic, cutting through the cold morning air like a blade. In a small ghetto that has already been half emptied, a child sitting on the windowsill hears it and flinches. He doesn't know why that sound terrifies him so deeply. He only knows that whenever the whistle blows, people disappear. His mother rushes to pull him away from the window, whispering frantically, "Don't look, don't look." But the child can still hear the rumble that follows, the grinding of metal wheels on tracks, the slow churning breath of a locomotive that has not come to bring goods or passengers or letters, but something else entirely. Something that has become the single most feared sound in every ghetto across occupied Europe. The trains have arrived again, and with them, another piece of the world will vanish forever. By 1942, the Nazis understood something terrifyingly simple. Bullets were too slow. Shooting people into pits was too resource-intensive. Gas vans were useful, but limited. The final solution needed something bigger, faster, more organized, more reliable. Something that could move entire populations not by dozens, not by hundreds, but by thousands at a time. Something that could turn genocide into a logistical operation as precise as a factory schedule. The answer was the Reichsbahn, the German rail system. The same network that once carried tourists, workers, students, farmers, soldiers, groceries, and mail would now become the backbone of mass murder. The same stations where children once waved at passing trains would now become loading platforms for human cargo. The same locomotives that connected cities would now transport people to their deaths. The tracks themselves, cold, unfeeling steel, became the arteries through which the machinery of genocide flowed. In German administrative buildings, far from the ghettos, officials discussed these transports with chilling detachment. They debated train schedules. They calculated travel times. They optimized routes. They allocated rolling stock. They negotiated fees, because even genocide had a price per person, charged by the kilometer. Every deportee had a cost, and the Reichsbahn billed the SS for each one. The paperwork looked identical to that used for livestock shipments, except for one detail. Humans were cheaper. In the ghettos, the trains arrived with a different rhythm than before. Less predictable, more frequent, more ominous. German soldiers marched into the streets with lists, with rifles, with fury. People were dragged from hiding places, beaten, shoved into lines, and herded toward the stations. The air filled with the sound of boots pounding on cobblestones, dogs barking, children screaming, orders shouted in German. The scent of sweat, smoke, and fear saturated everything. The train cars waiting at the siding were not passenger coaches. They were cattle cars, wooden, cramped, stained with the residue of previous shipments. The floors were rough and splintered. The walls were nailed shut with small, barred openings near the top. The doors slid on metal tracks with a deep, grating sound. These cars were never meant for humans. And yet the Germans packed them full of people. 80, 90, sometimes more than 100 in a single car meant for a dozen animals. There were no seats, no windows, no light, no air. When people were pushed inside, they stumbled over one another. Mothers clutched their children. Fathers tried to carve out space for breath. Elderly men and women collapsed before the doors were even shut. The crowd swayed, trying to keep balance, trying to stay together, trying to protect their loved ones. But there was no space. Bodies pressed so tightly that breathing itself became a struggle. The smell of urine and sweat filled the car within minutes. Someone fainted. Someone cried out. Someone prayed. Someone screamed. Then the door slammed shut. The darkness was immediate, total, suffocating. People pushed against the wood, pounding, begging for air. The small barred window, near the top, provided barely a sliver of oxygen. Everyone scrambled toward it, lifting children first, hoping to let them breathe. Those farther from the window suffocated slowly, pressed between bodies that grew hotter, weaker, heavier. The air turned thick and humid. The sound inside the car, labored breathing, sobbing, frantic whispers, grew louder. The train jolted forward. The nightmare had begun. Hours passed, sometimes days. The trains didn't stop. When they did, it was rarely for the people inside. Sometimes the stops were for military transports, because soldiers had priority. Sometimes for freight. Sometimes for nothing at all except bureaucratic delay. The people inside the cars knew nothing. They had no idea where they were, how far they had traveled, how much longer they would survive. Time dissolved into suffering. People tried to relieve themselves in corners, but the space was too tight. Waste pooled on the floor. The smell became unbearable. Children whimpered. Parents tried to comfort them, but their own strength was fading. Some prayed loudly, others silently. Some went mad from dehydration. Some died standing upright, their bodies propped by the crush of people around them. Workers in fields near railway lines sometimes saw trains of sealed cattle cars pass slowly in the distance. They heard muffled cries through the wooden slats. Some villagers looked away. Others crossed themselves. Some tried to sneak water to the trains, but German guards shot at anyone who approached. Inside the ghettos, those not yet deported knew what the trains meant. They listened for the whistles at night. They watched smoke rising from distant chimneys. They counted the days between transports. Some began building deeper, hiding places. Some attempted escapes. Some joined underground resistance groups. But many simply waited, paralyzed by exhaustion and terror. The ghettos had been starved, frozen, beaten, humiliated into submission long before the trains arrived in full force. German officers, overseeing the deportations, treated the process as routine. They checked lists. They verified numbers. They reported departures and arrivals. They ate breakfast while families were loaded into cars. They smoked cigarettes while children screamed for water. For them, this was logistics, work, duty. They never touched the victims. They simply pointed, instructed, recorded. Every transport had a destination. Sometimes the name was printed on forms. Sometimes it was coded. Sometimes it was purposefully vague. But the destination was always the same in spirit. Death. Treblinka. Belzec. Sobibor. Auschwitz-Birkenau. Majdanek. Names that would become synonymous with annihilation. At each camp, the arrival ritual was identical. The train slowed. The brakes screeched. The cars rattled to a stop. German guards approached with rifles. Some laughed. Some shouted orders. Some looked indifferent. The doors were flung open. Light poured into the darkness. People inside blinked, disoriented, blinded after days without sunlight. They stumbled out, tripping over bodies because there were always bodies left on the floor of the cars. Guards shouted at them to move faster. Dogs barked, straining at leashes. SS officers stood on platforms, inspecting the new arrivals like livestock. Selections occurred immediately. Men to one line, women to another. Children clinging to their parents were pulled away. The elderly were dragged aside. The air filled with cries that tore through the heart. Mothers fought to stay with their children. Fathers begged to rejoin their families. Soldiers beat anyone who resisted. What the people being selected didn't understand, what they could not understand, was that these lines were not for labor or resettlement. They were for death. Most people, usually the elderly, children, the weak, were sent directly to the gas chambers. They were told to undress. They were told to tie their shoes together to keep them from getting lost. They were told to remember the hook where they hung their belongings. These instructions were not kindness. They were deception. They were meant to maintain order, to prevent panic, to make mass murder efficient. Inside the gas chambers, people packed together tightly, just as they had inside the cattle cars. The doors shut. The lights went out. The engines roared to life. Carbon monoxide filled the room. Screams echoed. Nails clawed at walls. Mothers held their children's heads to their chests. Men pounded on doors until their fists bled. Within 15 to 30 minutes, silence. Meanwhile, another train was already on its way. The camps operated on schedules, daily, hourly. One transport left the ghetto in the morning, another in the afternoon, another at night. The smoke rising from the chimneys revealed the pace of killing. Inside the ghettos, those left behind saw the truth too late. In Warsaw, the smell of burning flesh drifted into the city on certain days. People whispered that the camps were killing bodies faster than they could bury them. In Lodz, the Judenrat begged the Germans for information, knowing full well that the deported were never coming back. In smaller ghettos, people panicked, hiding in cellars and bunkers as the German soldiers searched for them. Some ghettos collapsed in terror. Others rose up in desperation. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising, still months away, would become a symbol of resistance. But before came the trains. The endless, relentless trains. The Reichsbahn charged fares for Jews being deported. They charged full price for children under 10, half price for infants. The invoices were stamped, filed, archived. The brutality of genocide was buried in paperwork, filed away like shipping records. German engineers calculated how many trains per day each death camp could handle. They adjusted schedules to avoid traffic. They coordinated with military transport, all of it recorded in neat handwriting. The trains became the beating heart of the Holocaust. Not the gas chambers, not the shootings, not even the camps. The trains. Because without them, extermination on an industrial scale would have been impossible. One by one, ghettos emptied. Their streets grew quiet. Their walls cracked. Their synagogues stood abandoned. Their schools were silent. Their shops were shuttered. Only memories remained. Memories carried by the few who escaped, the few who hid, the few who survived the transports. But for the millions forced onto the trains, survival was nearly impossible. They disappeared into the machinery, into the chambers, into the pits, into the fires, into the history that the Nazis tried to erase. Inside the ghettos still standing, fear became a physical presence. People listened for whistles. They listened for engines. They listened for the sound of metal wheels approaching. Some prayed for delay. Some prayed for escape. Some prayed simply for the strength to face what was coming. But the trains always came. Always. They came in rain, in snow, in heat, at dawn, at midnight. They came until the ghettos were empty. They came until every street fell silent. They came until the final remnants of Jewish life were swept away. They came until the only trace of those who lived there was the ash falling from distant chimneys. And when the last train pulled away from the last ghetto, its whistle echoing faintly in the distance, it carried with it not just people, mothers, fathers, children, grandparents, friends, but the last thread of Jewish existence in cities that had once thrived with life, culture, and history. The tracks remained. The stations remained. The paperwork remained. But the people did not. And the world would not understand the full horror of these trains. Not yet. Not while the war continued. Not while the chimneys burned. Not while the whistles still pierced the air in ghetto after ghetto. The understanding would come later. For now, the trains continue to roll, toward the camps, toward the smoke, toward the final stage of annihilation. And the ghettos, emptied and silent, stood as monuments to a world being destroyed one transport at a time. Chapter 12. The Arrival Ramps. Selections. Lies in the first minutes in a death camp. It begins with a jolt so violent it tears people out of whatever thin sleep they manage to slip into. After hours, sometimes days, inside the suffocating darkness of the cattle car, the train slams to a halt with a metallic shriek, throwing bodies against wooden walls, knocking children from their mothers' arms, sending groans through the crush of limbs and exhaustion. Then, for a moment, everything is still. No one speaks. No one breathes. The silence is thick with dread. People strain to hear anything beyond the pounding of their own racing hearts. Then it comes, the sound they feared most. The clank of metal latches being unlocked. The heavy scrape of doors sliding open. A blinding flood of daylight and cold air crashes into the car, revealing a nightmare that makes the darkness behind them feel merciful. SS soldiers shout. Dogs bark. Whips crack. People shield their eyes, blinking rapidly, but there is no time to adjust. Rough hands pull them out, one by one, into a world they do not recognize and will not survive. They have arrived at a death camp. The first thing they see is the ground beneath their feet. Mud, gravel, sometimes snow, littered with debris left behind by earlier transports. Torn shoes, bits of fabric, empty suitcases. The remnants of people who arrived filled with the same hope these new arrivals carried hours earlier. A hope that will vanish within minutes. The second thing they see is the smoke. Thick, oily, rising from chimneys in slow, swirling plumes. It hangs in the air like a toxic fog, settling on clothes, skin, and hair. Some people ask aloud what is burning. A child tugs at his mother's sleeve and points to the smoke. The mother, too afraid to answer, tells him it's just a factory. But the smell, sweet, acrid, unmistakable, makes even the strongest stomach twist. The truth lurks at the edge of understanding, a horror too large for the mind to grasp. The third thing they see is the machine, the system of murder laid out before them like a grotesque assembly line. Uniformed SS officers stand near wooden tables, clipboards in hand. Capos, prisoners forced into service, rush around shouting orders. Guards prod the dazed prisoners into lines. The dogs snap at stragglers. The air vibrates with commands barked in German. Faster. Leave your baggage. Women to the left. Men to the right. The selection begins immediately. There is no explanation, no decision, no negotiation, just a single gesture. An SS officer, often with a white glove, sometimes with a riding crop, stand at the center of the chaos and points. Left, right, left, right. The motion is quick, almost effortless, as if he were brushing away dust rather than determining the fate of human lives. To the right, those deemed able to work. Mostly men, some women, teenagers, young adults. They stand confused but relieved. Some believe they have been spared for a labor camp. Some believe they will reunite with their families after processing. They cling to any piece of hope, no matter how fragile. To the left, everyone else. Children, elderly people, pregnant women, the sick, the weak, mothers holding infants, fathers supporting wives. Entire families are torn apart in seconds. A mother begs to stay with her child. The officer points again left. She clings to the child. A guard strikes her with the butt of a rifle. She collapses. Two soldiers pull her away. The child screams as he is pushed toward the group destined to die. This moment, the selection, is designed to break the human spirit before the gas ever touches the lungs. The ones directed to the left have no idea what awaits them. They are told they are going to the showers. They are told they need to be disinfected after the journey. They are told to undress to receive clean clothing. The lies are delivered with calm, professional tones. The deception is deliberate. Panic slows the process. Hope speeds it up. The ones directed to the right are marched away quickly, out of sight. Some look back over their shoulders, searching frantically for their families. A father sees his daughter in the left-hand line and screams her name. A soldier strikes him, forcing him forward. A wife sees her husband stagger into the labor group and reaches out to him, only for guards to shove her toward the gas chambers. Their eyes lock for a single, eternal second, a silent goodbye neither is prepared for, before the crowd pulls them apart. The ramp is a place where time breaks. Seconds feel like hours. Hours feel like seconds. People do not understand what is happening. They try to make sense of the chaos. They ask questions. They cling to the lies because the alternative feels impossible. They are still wearing their best clothes, still carrying suitcases with family photographs, prayer books, heirlooms. They still believe they are people moving to another place. They don't know that the camp has already stripped them of their humanity. The suitcases, those carefully packed with food, jackets, and keepsakes, are tossed into piles. Workers from the Sonderkommando collect them. These prisoners move with horrifying efficiency. They avoid looking anyone in the eye. They know the truth of what happens next. They know that, within hours, these suitcases will be sorted, emptied, and shipped to Germany. They know that the belongings of the living will become the property. But the SS officers do something else with the belongings, something crueler. They arrange the storage area in neat rows, with signs labeled shoes, or children's clothing, or valuables. The illusion of organization is designed to reinforce the lie. This is temporary. This is a resettlement camp. You will get your belongings later. Some prisoners even ask, "Will we get our suitcases back?" The officer smiles. Of course. This is the machinery of deception. The left-hand group, those selected for immediate death, is led down a path. The path may curve, intentionally, so they cannot see the chimneys or the bodies being removed from the previous shipment. Guards speak to them with forced politeness, offering reassurance. Hold your children tightly. Remember your hook number, so you can find your clothes. Walk calmly. The prisoners move forward, tired and confused, many believing they will take a shower after days on the train. They arrive at a building disguised as a bathhouse. The exterior is clean. The door is solid. Sometimes there are fake shower heads attached to the ceiling. Sometimes painted on signs. The door opens, and they are herded inside. The room grows crowded. Men and women stand shoulder to shoulder. Children cling to their parents, crying softly. People press against the walls, uncomfortable and anxious. Guards tell them to hang their clothes on pegs and remember the number. This final lie helps maintain order. Parents undress their children. Some comfort them with trembling hands. A mother kisses her baby's forehead. A father wraps his arm around his wife. A teenage boy shakes uncontrollably. A girl whispers a prayer under her breath. Then the door slams shut. Workers lock them from the outside. A heavy bar drops into place. In the next room, SS officers start the engine that pumps carbon monoxide into the chamber. The sound of the engine muffles the cries at first. Then the gas fills the room, and panic erupts. People claw at the walls, at the ceiling, at each other. They scream, choke, gasp for air that no longer exists. Mothers lift their children, trying to help them breathe for a few more seconds. Couples cling to one another. Individuals collapse. The screams weaken. Within minutes, silence. The doors are opened. The Sonderkommando, Jewish prisoners forced to assist in the killing process, enter the chamber. They choke on the fumes. They see the bodies piled upon one another, twisted in impossible shapes, fingers bruised from clawing wood or cement. Children are crushed between adults. Babies are still clutched in their mother's arms. The workers drag the bodies to the crematoria or mass graves. They strip the corpses of valuables, rings, necklaces, gold teeth. They cry silently, broken by the work they are forced to do. They know that any mistake will get them killed. They know that their own lives depend on making death as efficient as possible. Meanwhile, on the arrival ramp, another train is ready to unload. Inside the camp, the right-hand group, the ones selected for labor, begin their own descent into hell. They are marched to barracks. Their heads are shaved. They are deloused. They are beaten. They are stripped of their names and assigned numbers. Their identities vanish instantly, replaced by tattoos or patches. They are issued striped uniforms that barely protect them from the cold. They are told to work. Work will keep them alive for now. Work will break their bodies. Work will starve them. Work will kill them slowly. But even the labor force does not understand the full truth. They see smoke. They smell burning flesh. They hear screams. They feel death pressing in around them, but they cannot grasp its scale. Some believe that the chimneys belong to industrial factories. Some convince themselves that the death stories are exaggerations. Others know the truth and endure each day with the knowledge that their lives depend on their usefulness. This cycle repeats every hour, every day, every week. Train arrives. Selection occurs. Gas chambers fill. Bodies burn. Smoke rises. And another train arrives. The arrival ramp becomes the most important part of the camp, a portal through which millions pass, never to return. The SS perfect their methods. They time the trains precisely. They coordinate with railway schedules hundreds of kilometers away. They issue demands to the ghettos. Deliver more people, faster, more efficiently. They measure the speed of selections. They calculate the gas use times. They increase chamber capacity. They test hotter crematorium fires. This is not murder as impulse. This is murder as engineering. For the prisoners, the ramp becomes the place where hope dies. A family arrives after days in a sealed train. They look around, disoriented. The mother scans the crowd for a friendly face. The father stares at the chimneys, confusion creeping into fear. The child rubs his eyes and asks, "Where are we?" No one answers. The officers shout. They are pushed into lines. They are separated. They vanish into the machinery. The ramp is where the world ends for them. The lies told on the ramp are the most devastating lies ever spoken in human history. Not just because of their cruelty, but because they were designed to convince people to walk calmly toward death. Even the most brave, the most desperate, the most aware found themselves clinging to the possibility that the lies were true, that the showers were showers, that the work camps were real, that the families would be reunited. But no one ever came back from the gas chambers. No one ever retrieved their suitcase. No one ever found the hook where their clothes hung. The ramp was the final threshold, and every person forced to cross it, every mother, every father, every child, every elder, crossed into a world where nothing human remained except the faint echo of their final breaths. And as long as the trains kept coming, the ramp stayed busy. The only question left was how long the machinery could run, and how many millions would pass through it before the world finally learned what happened behind the chimneys, behind the fences, behind the lies. The trains were still rolling. The smoke was still rising. The ramp was still waiting. And the ghettos, almost empty now, were about to face their final days. Chapter 13. The Disappearance of Ghettos. Last uprisings and final clearances. It begins with a silence, so heavy it feels unnatural, as if the very air is holding its breath. In the Warsaw Ghetto, once overflowing with the noise of life, even in suffering, the streets now sit nearly empty. The buildings, once bursting with families, echo with nothing but wind slipping through broken windows. A piece of cloth flutters from a windowsill where someone once hung laundry. A child's toy lies half buried in dust. The familiar smell of overcrowded rooms, smoke, sweat, sickness, has faded. In its place is the scent of something colder, abandonment. It is a silence that does not soothe. It suffocates, because it is the silence of a world already dying. By 1943, the ghettos across occupied Europe are shadows of what they once were, stripped of the majority of their populations, emptied by liquidations, transports, shootings, disease, and starvation. Entire districts have become graveyards without tombstones. Yet in these ruins, something unexpected begins to stir. A spark, a decision, a line drawn not in sand, but in despair. For the Jews who remain, those too young, too strong, too defiant, or too hidden to have been deported, understand one truth with terrifying clarity. Deportation is death. There is no resettlement, no labor assignments, no new life awaiting them in the East. Only gas, smoke, and ash. And if death is inevitable, then resistance becomes not a strategy for survival, but a final declaration of existence. The first whispers of resistance begin long before the last liquidations. In the rubble of deserted apartments, survivors dig through cupboards for weapons, kitchen knives, iron pipes, anything sharp enough to cut or heavy enough to strike. Underground networks form quietly, built by teenagers barely old enough to shave. They smuggle guns through sewers. They print leaflets urging revolt. They study German patrol patterns, memorizing every blind corner, every weak spot, every moment when the guards seem less alert. They know they cannot win. They know they will die. But they also know that death with dignity is better than death in a chamber. In Warsaw, the largest ghetto in Europe, resistance takes shape under the leadership of young fighters from the Jewish Combat Organization and the Jewish Military Union. They are armed with pistols smuggled at great risk, a handful of grenades, a few rifles stolen from German warehouses, and homemade explosives fashioned from scraps. They train in small, dark rooms lit by candles, practicing how to throw Molotov cocktails, how to aim, how to move silently. But above all, they train their minds to accept that their fight is not for victory, it is for meaning. They wait, they watch, and they prepare for the day the Germans will come to finish the job. That day arrives in April 1943. German forces, well-armed, well-fed, confident, march toward the Warsaw Ghetto expecting another liquidation like all the others. Swift, brutal, total. But the ghetto is not still. The silence is deceptive. Behind walls, in bunkers dug beneath buildings, fighters grip their weapons and steady their breath. When the Germans breach the ghetto, they walk into their first ambush. Grenades explode. Gunshots crack through the air. Flames erupt from windows. German soldiers stagger back, shocked, unprepared for resistance from people they long ago dismissed as weak and broken. The uprising has begun. It is fierce, chaotic, and astonishing. Jewish fighters strike from rooftops, from alleyways, from hidden bunkers. They use the ruins of their own world as battlegrounds. A girl no older than 17 hurls a grenade that sends a German patrol scrambling. A boy of 15 shoots a soldier from a window, then slips away unseen. Elderly residents bring food and water to fighters. Mothers hide wounded resistors in basements. Children serve as lookouts, darting through debris like ghosts. For days, the German advance stalls. The SS grows frustrated. They respond with overwhelming force, flamethrowers, artillery, tanks. They set entire blocks on fire. Smoke billows into the sky, choking fighters and civilians alike. Flames light up the ruins like funeral pyres. People emerge coughing, gasping, only to be shot where they stand. But the resistance does not stop. They fight on as the buildings collapse around them, fighting in rooms where families once dined, fighting in streets where children once played. But gunfire is not the only battleground. Beneath the ghetto, a labyrinth of sewers becomes a lifeline. Fighters use them to communicate, to escape, to launch surprise attacks. The sewers, dark, foul, suffocating, become tunnels of defiance. The Germans try to flood them. They drop grenades into manholes. But still, fighters crawl through the darkness, gripping pistols between their teeth, determination stronger than the stench that surrounds them. Above ground, the Germans begin burning the ghetto systematically. One building, then another, then entire blocks. They want to smoke the fighters out, force them into the open. Flames roar against the night sky. Walls crack and collapse. Smoke pours upward, carrying with it the remnants of a world that once held 500,000 people. The heat is unbearable. Skin blisters. Eyes tear. The air becomes unbreathable. Yet even then, even in the inferno, resistance continues. A fighter hiding in a burning building fires his last bullet before flames engulf him. Another group, refusing to surrender, chooses to die together in their bunker rather than face German bullets. In one of the most symbolic acts of defiance, fighters raise a handmade flag over the ghetto, a white and red Polish banner beside a blue and white Jewish flag. Two nations united in rebellion. Two identities refusing erasure. The Germans crush the uprising ruthlessly, but they cannot crush what it means. For nearly a month, the ghetto holds out. For nearly a month, starving, exhausted, outnumbered Jews resist one of the most powerful armies in the world. Their fight becomes a symbol whispered across occupied Europe. The Jews are resisting. They're not going quietly. This pattern repeats elsewhere. In Białystok, fighters stage an uprising during liquidation. They ambush guards, set buildings on fire, and attempt to break through the ghetto walls. They are crushed within days, but they force the Germans to take casualties. Their resistance sends a message that echoes across miles of ravaged land. We will not die without a fight. In Vilna, the Vereinigte Partisanenorganisatie, the United Partisan Organization, plans a coordinated uprising, but is forced into the forests when the Germans destroy the ghetto first. They become partisans, sabotaging rail lines, attacking German patrols, saving others when they can. Even in small ghettos, Tarnow, Chinstykova, Minsk-Mazowiecki, people resist in whatever ways they can, sabotaging machinery, burning records, hiding children, killing collaborators, refusing to board trains. These acts do not change their fate, but they change the story. They challenge the myth of Jewish passivity, a myth the Nazis like to spread to justify their brutality. As resistance flares, the Germans accelerate their plan. The ghettos must be erased completely. No structure left standing. No community left intact. No trace of Jewish presence. They move from city to city, town to town, village to village, tearing down walls, torching homes, demolishing synagogues. Bulldozers crush the remains of Jewish streets. Cemeteries are desecrated. Tombstones are used as construction material. Entire neighborhoods become open fields. The last Jews in many ghettos are forced into smaller sections, often called residual ghettos or work ghettos. They are told they will live if they work. This is another lie. Weeks later, these ghettos are liquidated too. In Alad's ghetto, one of the largest and longest-lasting, people cling to life through forced labor. They produce textiles and boots for the German army. They believed that usefulness might save them. Their leader, Chaim Rumkowski, pleads with the Germans again and again to spare the workers. For a time, it works. But in 1944, the Germans decide that the ghetto is no longer necessary. Transports begin. Trains depart for Auschwitz. The last remnants of the ghetto vanish into smoke. In the Krakow ghetto, German forces carry out the final liquidation with horrifying brutality. They shoot people in the streets. They force others onto trucks bound for Plasso. They murder children at the orphanage, dragging them from their beds as if they were nothing. The screams echo through the night as flames consume the last buildings. In smaller ghettos, liquidation is even faster. German units push through streets, killing anyone who hesitates. The remaining Jews are marched out, some to death camps, some to forced labor camps, few to survival. Those who hide in bunkers often suffocate or are burned alive when the Germans torch entire rows of houses to flush them out. By 1944, almost no ghettos remain. The world that once held the largest Jewish population in Europe, cities bursting with culture, synagogues overflowing with worshippers, markets filled with vendors, schools filled with children, has been gutted. Warsaw's Jewish quarter, once home to more than 400,000 people, is gone. Its buildings are rubble. Its streets are ash. Its people are smoke drifting into the sky over Treblinka. The disappearance is so complete that when Allied forces later pass through the territories, many do not realize ghettos ever existed. There is nothing left to indicate they were once alive. Only photographs, diaries buried beneath rubble, and a few surviving witnesses tell the story. But the story is not only one of destruction. It is also one of unimaginable courage. In every ghetto, even in the final days, people resist in ways both large and small. A woman smuggles a baby out in a sack of potatoes. A teacher continues lessons for the last children remaining. A rabbi whispers a final prayer in a hidden room. A father gives his bread to his daughter. A boy steals a German rifle. A girl throws a Molotov cocktail from a rooftop. A family digs a tunnel beneath a wall. A teenager, knowing he will die, writes his story on a scrap of paper and hides it in a bottle. These acts, small as they seem, are acts of defiance, acts of existence, acts of humanity in a world engineered to crush humanity. And yet, the brutality of the final clearances leaves no doubt. The ghettos were never meant to be permanent. They were holding pens for slaughter. And now, their purpose is fulfilled. The Germans move to the next phase of the final solution with chilling efficiency. Those who survive the ghettos will now face the death camps, the labor camps, the death marches. The ghettos, the forced communities of suffering, resilience, starvation, hope, despair, and resistance, are gone. Where once there were narrow streets filled with Yiddish songs, there is silence. Where once there were markets bustling with life, there is rubble. Where once there were families gathering for holidays, there is ash. Where once there were millions, there are now ghosts. And yet, as the ghettos disappear, a new chapter of the Holocaust emerges, one even more desperate, more harrowing, more deadly. Because those who survive the liquidations will soon face the death camps at full capacity. They will face selections, gas chambers, crematoria. They will face forced labor. They will face death marches through snow and mud. They will face a world collapsing around them. The ghettos have fallen, but the nightmare is not over. It is entering its final, catastrophic stage. Chapter 14. The Ashes of Europe. What happened to the ghetto survivors? It begins with footsteps, dragging, uneven, hollow. Not the thunder of marching soldiers this time. Not the synchronized stomp of German boots echoing through narrow alleys, but the fragile, staggering sound of people who have already lost everything and are now being driven into the next chapter of their suffering. A line of former ghetto prisoners walks through the gates of a labor camp at dawn. Their faces are gray with exhaustion, their bodies skeletal, their eyes glassy with shock. They have survived the ghetto. They survived liquidation, hiding places, deportation, selections. But as they step into this new prison, they realize something terrible. the nightmare didn't end with the trains. The nightmare simply changed shape. For the few who escaped deportation or survived the selections upon arrival at the camps, life splintered into new forms of torment. Some were sent to forced labor camps, others to concentration camps, others to death camps where only temporary usefulness delayed execution. Others fled into forests and joined partisan groups. Each path was different, but they shared one thing. Survival was a daily, brutal fight against hunger, exhaustion, disease, cold, and despair. Inside the labor camps, the workday began before sunrise and ended long after sunset. The sound of whistles and dogs jolted prisoners from restless sleep each morning. Barracks were overcrowded, infested with lice, freezing in winter and suffocating in summer. Prisoners slept on wooden planks or thin straw mattresses, crawling with vermin. They awoke already exhausted, bones aching, stomachs hollow. Breakfast was a cup of watery coffee or thin soup, sometimes a piece of bread so small it disappeared in 2 bites. Hunger became a permanent companion, sharp, burning, endlessly gnawing. Work details varied. Some were sent to quarries where they hauled giant stones up steep inclines until their muscles tore. Others dug trenches, built roads, cleared forests, repaired rail lines. Many worked in German factories producing ammunition, uniforms, boots, or aircraft components, feeding the very war machine that sought their destruction. Guards patrolled constantly, barking orders, striking prisoners with rifle butts, forcing them to run even when their legs could barely support them. Anyone who collapsed were beaten. Anyone who fell behind was shot. The work was designed to kill slowly, to squeeze the last bit of strength from bodies already weakened by years of ghetto starvation. Survival depended on instinct, luck, and connections. Prisoners formed quiet alliances, sharing scraps of food, covering for one another during inspections, helping those who stumbled. A stolen potato could mean an extra day of life. A sympathetic capo could mean the difference between being assigned to a work detail that killed within hours or one that allowed for a few weeks more. Even small acts of kindness became monumental. Someone offering their half of a bread crust, someone whispering a warning about an upcoming selection, someone helping another prisoner to stand upright during roll call. Disease ravaged every camp. Typhus swept through barracks like fire. Dysentery left prisoners too weak to walk. Tuberculosis hollowed out bodies. There were no medications, no sanitation, no clean water. The sick lay in bunks, shivering and delirious, often ignored by guards who saw illness as a natural method of eliminating prisoners. In some camps, the infirmaries became places of death. Prisoners walked in, but rarely walked out. But despite the risk, some prisoners volunteered to work in the infirmaries, cleaning wounds with scraps of cloth, offering cups of water, holding the hands of those dying so they would not leave the world alone. In the death camps, survival was even more precarious. Those selected for labor lasted only weeks or months before starvation, disease, or exhaustion took their lives. The Sonderkommando, prisoners forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoria, lived under constant psychological torment, knowing the truth of the extermination more intimately than anyone else. They moved bodies from chambers, pulled out gold teeth, cut hair, cleaned the floors. They performed these tasks with numb hands and shattered spirits, knowing that after a few months, they too would be killed to erase witnesses. But even within these horrors, flickers of resistance appeared. Sonderkommando members smuggled out notes, buried photographs, wrote diaries detailing the operation of the camps. They stored them in bottles and cans beneath the earth, hoping someone, someday, would find them. They documented everything the Nazis tried to hide. These scraps of testimony became some of the most crucial evidence of the Holocaust. For some survivors, the path of survival led not through camps but into the forests. When the ghettos fell, a few fled through sewers, tunnels, or holes in walls and escaped into the surrounding countryside. They ran through fields under cover of night, through forests thick with thorns and wolves, through marshes that threatened to swallow them whole. Being caught meant immediate execution. Being discovered by locals could mean betrayal. But those who made it into the deep forest found resistance groups, Jewish partisans, Soviet partisans, Polish fighters, living in hidden encampments. Life with the partisans was harsh, but it offered something the ghettos and camps did not: agency. Jewish partisans sabotaged German supply lines, destroyed rail tracks, ambushed patrols, smuggled weapons to ghettos, and rescued children. They fought not only to survive, but to avenge their families. But survival in the forest was brutal. Winter froze limbs, food was scarce, lice burrowed into skin, German patrols hunted them constantly. Many partisans died in battle. Others died from hunger or exposure. But those who lived carried the weight of their resistance with a fierce, unbreakable pride. For some survivors, hiding became their only option. Families dug bunkers beneath their homes, or hid in barns, attics, cellars, sewers, or abandoned factories. Some spent months or years crouched in darkness, emerging only at night to breathe fresh air or gather scraps of food brought by sympathetic neighbors. They listened to the world above, footsteps, gunfire, dogs, rain, and waited for liberation. Some lost their minds in the silence. Some emerged from hiding, unable to speak or walk. Some discovered that the people who hid them were betrayed and killed. But others survived because strangers risked everything to protect them. As 1944 approached, the tide of the war began to turn. The Red Army advanced from the east. The Allies advanced from the west. German forces grew increasingly desperate, increasingly brutal. Camps were evacuated. Prisoners were marched deeper into the Reich in freezing temperatures, wearing nothing but thin uniforms and wooden clogs. These were the death marches. The marches were designed to kill. Prisoners were forced to walk for days, weeks, sometimes hundreds of kilometers, in snow, mud, or scorching heat. They were given no food, no water, no rest. Guards shot anyone who stumbled. The sides of the roads became lined with bodies, frozen, starved, collapsed. Survivors described the sensation of walking while half dead, numb to pain, driven by instinct alone. Some leaned on strangers. Some were dragged by friends. Some crawled when their legs failed. At night, prisoners slept in barns or open fields. Frostbite claimed hands, feet, ears. The ground became littered with corpses. Those who survived one day rarely survived the next. Camps like Auschwitz, Stutthof, and Gross-Rosen emptied their populations through these marches. Tens of thousands died. But even on the marches, acts of compassion emerged. Prisoners sharing crumbs, lifting someone who had fallen, whispering words of encouragement. Liberation came unevenly and unevenly understood. When Soviet soldiers entered Majdanek in the summer of 1944, they were astonished. They had expected to find a labor camp, not evidence of industrialized murder. Gas chambers, crematoria, piles of ashes, collections of shoes, bags, human remains. They documented everything, unaware that the world would later accuse them of exaggeration. When the Red Army entered Auschwitz in January 1945, they found mountains of hair, piles of children's clothing, abandoned barracks, and a few thousand survivors, sick, emaciated, barely alive. Many survivors were too weak to stand. Some crawled toward the soldiers, desperate for water. Others stared blankly, minds broken by years of horror. Soviet medics fed survivors warm broth and carried them out on stretchers. Yet, even liberation was not salvation. Many survivors died in the weeks after freedom because their bodies were too damaged to recover. Western Allied forces liberated camps like Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and Mauthausen. They found scenes that defied comprehension. Open pits filled with corpses, barracks overflowing with disease, prisoners lying on bare floors, too weak to lift their heads. Soldiers gagged from a stench. Many wept at the sight. They treated survivors, buried the dead, burned down diseased barracks, and documented everything with photographs and film. But liberation did not mean the end of suffering. Survivors faced a world that no longer contained their families. Entire communities had vanished. Homes were occupied by strangers. Synagogues destroyed. Streets renumbered. Names erased. Survivors often returned to their hometowns only to face hostility, violence, or rejection. In some places, returning Jews were attacked or murdered by local populations who had taken their property. Many realized they had no place to go. Thousands of survivors ended up in displaced persons camps, DP camps, run by Allied forces. These camps were crowded, underfunded, chaotic. Yet within them, life flickered back. People married. Children were born. Survivors found one another, sometimes discovering relatives they believed dead. Names were read aloud every morning at bulletin boards where survivors searched desperately for someone, anyone, from their past. Sometimes they found a brother, a cousin, a friend. More often, the lists offered only heartbreak. Many could not go home. Many did not want to. They emigrated to Palestine, to the United States, to Canada, to South America, to Australia. They rebuilt their lives from ashes. They opened businesses, started families, built communities, but the trauma followed them always. Some never spoke of the past. Others spoke of nothing else. Some wrote memoirs. Others burned their diaries. Some found strength in faith. Others lost their belief entirely. Trauma took many forms: nightmares, silence, anger, guilt, fear. Survivors' guilt became a shadow they carried forever. Why did I live when others died? Why did I survive when my family did not? Why did I run when others stayed? Why did I hide when others fought? These questions haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Some became witnesses, tirelessly speaking to schools, courts, journalists, historians, telling the world what had happened in the ghettos, the camps, the forests, the death marches. Their testimonies built the foundation for Holocaust education, remembrance, and justice. Others never found the strength to speak. The memories were too painful, the wounds too deep. The ashes of Europe, the ashes that filled the air around the camps, that coated the ground, that blew into the sky with every gust of wind, settled into the hearts of those who survived. They carried the weight of millions on their shoulders. Every breath they took after liberation was a breath someone else never received. And yet, despite the horror, survivors rebuilt. Some found love again. Some raised children. Some created art. Some pursued education. Some fought for human rights. They rebuilt because living itself became an act of defiance, a declaration that the Nazis had failed to destroy them entirely. Every child born to a survivor became a small victory against a world that tried to erase them. Still, the scars remained. Still, the trauma never fully disappeared. Still, the memories burned. The ghettos had been the beginning of the destruction. The camps had been the center. The survivors lived through all of it and carried the past into the future. The ashes of Europe were not just literal. They were the remains of a world burned to nothing, and the foundation for which a new world struggled to rise. In the next and final chapter, the world will finally learn what happened in the shadows. Testimonies will emerge. Photographs will surface. Trials will begin. And for the first time, humanity will look directly at the machinery of its darkest chapter and ask, how could this happen? But the survivors, the ones who lived through ghettos, camps, forests, and marches, already knew the answer. They knew because they carried the truth in their bones. They carried it in their memories. They carried it in their silence, in their nightmares, in their voices, in their children, in their courage. They carried it because there was no one else left to do so. And now, in the aftermath of destruction, the world would have to decide what. Chapter 15, Counting the Dead. How the world finally learned the truth. It begins with a door being forced open, wood cracking, hinges twisting, dust exploding into the cold morning air. The soldiers who break into the room expect to find an enemy combatant, a sniper's nest, a German officer hiding among the ruins. Instead, they find silence. A silence so deep it feels like a physical presence, pressing against them, pushing the breath from their lungs. The room is bare except for a table covered in small, carefully stacked suitcases. The soldiers approach, confused, until they notice the names painted on the suitcases in neat white letters. Hundreds of names. Jewish names. Names of people who were supposed to be resettled. Names of people who never reached any new homes. One soldier touches a suitcase gently, as though afraid to disturb a ghost. He lifts the lid. Inside is a child's dress, a pair of shoes, a family photograph, two blonde girls smiling into the sun. The soldier stares at their faces, then at the empty room around him, and only one thought forms clearly in his mind. Where did they all go? Across occupied Europe, Allied soldiers are making discoveries like this in early 1945. Not only in abandoned offices, but in forests, in tunnels, in train stations, in fields that hide pits beneath their snow-covered surfaces. And soon, horrifically, they will discover the places where those names, those suitcases, those families ended. But in the beginning, no one understands the scale of what they are finding. They know something monstrous happened. They do not yet know that they are walking through the aftermath of the largest, most systematic mass murder in human history. The first major revelation comes at Majdanek. When Soviet forces arrive in the summer of 1944, they expect to find a labor camp or perhaps a prison. Instead, they find rows of barracks filled with rotting bodies, gas chambers still stained with Zyklon B residue, crematoria ovens half destroyed, piles of ashes several feet deep. They find 7 enormous gas chambers, some disguised as shower rooms, waiting in silence. They find warehouses filled with thousands of shoes. They find mountains of hair. They find drawers full of baby clothes. They find notes hidden under floorboards. They find entire rooms filled with stolen belongings sorted by color and size. The soldiers stand in stunned disbelief. The camp looks abandoned only hours earlier. The gas chambers still smell faintly of chemicals. The crematoria ovens are still warm. The Nazis fled so quickly that they left behind evidence of their crimes. The Soviets record everything. They photograph the bodies. They film the buildings. They interview survivors who are too weak to stand, but desperate to speak. But when the photographs reach the West, many refuse to believe them. The Allied governments fear exaggeration. Journalists think the images must be Soviet propaganda. The crimes seem too enormous, too grotesque, too impossible. Then Auschwitz falls. In January 1945, Soviet soldiers enter the gates. Arbeit macht frei looms overhead like a bitter joke. The snow crunches beneath their boots. The soldiers move through the camp slowly, not expecting anything more than another prison. But then they see the survivors, thousands of them, skin stretched over bones, shivering in the cold, too weak to stand, too tired to speak. Some crawl toward the soldiers, collapsing at their feet. Some reach out their hands, unable to form words. Some stare blankly into space, minds shattered by what they endured. And then the soldiers see the rest. The clothing warehouses, the piles of human hair, the suitcases with children's names, the barracks filled with corpses, the ash pits behind the crematoria, the gas chamber door with deep scratches carved by fingernails. Soldiers weep openly. Hardened men who fought through years of brutal combat fall to their knees and cry. They help survivors drink warm water, wrap them in blankets, lift them onto stretchers. They look at the crematoria chimneys rising above the snow and cannot imagine how many people died here, how many families, how many stories ended in smoke drifting across the frozen fields. Word spreads quickly. Auschwitz, Majdanek, Treblinka, ruins and bones. Sobibor, bulldozed but still leaving traces. Belzec, nothing left except earth that refuses to grow grass. Chelmno, forests filled with ash beneath a thin layer of soil. For the first time, the scale of the genocide begins to break through global disbelief. Yet understanding is not immediate. It comes slowly, painfully, in fragments. Soldiers find rooms filled with files, registration sheets, transport lists, deportation schedules. They begin piecing together the machinery of murder, the ghettos, the trains, the selections, the gas chambers, the crematoria, the hiding of ashes. Historians, journalists, and military analysts sort through the documentation with growing horror. Meanwhile, survivors begin to speak. They tell their stories with broken voices, whispering through cracked lips. Some speak in long, uninterrupted streams, desperate to empty their memories before they die. Others struggle to form sentences at all. The things they describe seem unbelievable. Rooms disguised as showers, children torn from parents, mountains of shoes, pits filled with bodies. These stories spread quickly, sometimes by the media, sometimes by word of mouth, sometimes by soldiers carrying the memories home like invisible wounds. But in the West, disbelief still lingers. Many think prisoners exaggerate. Others assume rumors distorted their memories. Some argue that such systematic cruelty is impossible. No society, no army, no government could commit atrocities on this level. Then the Western Allies reach Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Mittelbau-Dora, and dozens of other camps. At Belsen, British soldiers walk into a landscape of corpses. Thousands of bodies lie scattered across the ground, half naked, mouths open, eyes staring upward at nothing. Survivors wander through the piles, dazed, emaciated, some barely alive. The stench is overpowering. Soldiers vomit, cry, scream at their officers. Some faint. Some develop psychological trauma from witnessing so much death in one place. Photographers capture everything because they know the world will not believe them otherwise. At Dachau, American soldiers find train cars filled with corpses, people who died during transport or were executed shortly before liberation. They find prisoners too weak to walk, too scared to speak, too traumatized to understand that the Germans have fled. In some cases, enraged American soldiers execute SS guards on the spot. The fury becomes uncontrollable. The horror is too overwhelming. At Dora Mittelbau, soldiers find tunnels where thousands of slave laborers died constructing V-2 rockets for Germany's final desperate gamble. The bodies are stacked like wood, covered in dust, twisted by starvation and disease. No one doubts anymore. The death camps are real. The mass graves are real. The extermination is real. And now the world begins the impossible task, counting the dead. There are no exact numbers. The Nazis destroyed thousands of records. They burned documents. They bulldozed camps. They killed Sonderkommando witnesses. Yet even with the destruction, enough evidence remains. Transport lists, survivor testimonies, German memos, Allied reports, to estimate the scale of the genocide. 6 million Jews murdered. 1.5 million children. Entire families wiped out. Entire towns emptied. Entire cultures erased. The staggering weight of this number crushes the world's conscience. How had no one known? How had entire nations ignored the warning signs? Why were the ghettos allowed to starve? Why were the trains not bombed? Why were the camps not liberated sooner? These questions ignite fury. And from this fury, the Nuremberg trials are born. In late 1945, the Allies establish a tribunal to prosecute high-ranking Nazi officials. In the courtroom, photographs of mass graves are projected on screens. Films taken by liberators are shown. Survivors testify, describing the horrors of ghettos, trains, selections, gas chambers, crematoria. Guards describe their roles. Commandants attempt to lie, to minimize, to deny, but the evidence is overwhelming. One witness, a survivor from Treblinka, recounts how entire transports were obliterated within hours. Another describes the smoke from crematoria falling like black snow. A Sonderkommando member describes dragging bodies from gas chambers, stacking them like logs, burning them until only ash remained. His hands shake. His voice trembles. But he continues, because the dead cannot speak, and he must speak for them. The world listens. Some judges cry. Others grip their chairs until their knuckles turn white. The phrase crimes against humanity is coined because no existing words can adequately describe the Holocaust. At the same time, the world begins to understand something even more horrifying. The ghettos were not chaotic, spontaneous, or random. They were an early stage of a carefully engineered system. They were designed to isolate, weaken, starve, monitor, and prepare populations for eventual extermination. The trains were not a last-minute improvisation. They were planned years in advance. The camps were not accidents. They were built as factories of death. This realization reshapes humanity's understanding of evil. It is not sudden. It is not emotional. It is not uncontrolled. It can be cold, calculated, bureaucratic, documented, efficient. Evil can wear a uniform. Evil can hold a pen. Evil can fill out forms. Evil can run on schedules. The world begins to ask deeper questions. How did ordinary people participate? How did neighbors turn away? How did the world stay silent? How did humanity fracture so completely? Survivors become the conscience of a new era. They speak in schools, in universities, in courts, in synagogues, in churches, in newspapers. Some write memoirs. Some give interviews. Some testify at trials. Some remain silent for decades and then, suddenly, begin to speak as old age approaches, driven by the fear that their memories will die with them. And yet, even as testimonies spread, the survivors face unimaginable losses. Most discover that every member of their family is dead. Most return to hometowns only to find strangers occupying their homes. Most search through lists of survivors posted in DP camps and hospitals. Names typed, handwritten, scratched onto boards, but rarely find anyone. Some try to rebuild in Europe, but face anti-Semitic violence. Others emigrate, carrying only memories and nightmares. Some struggle for the rest of their lives with trauma, depression, survivor's guilt. But they rebuild anyway, because rebuilding is resistance. Rebuilding is defiance. Rebuilding is the continuation of a story the Nazis tried to erase. Over time, museums emerge. Yad Vashem, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, countless memorials built on former ghetto streets or camp ruins. Scholars gather testimonies, research archives, study perpetrator documents. The truth becomes undeniable, inescapable, undeniable. Yet even with all the evidence, the world struggles with the final question: what does it mean to truly know? Because knowing the facts is not enough. Knowing the numbers is not enough. Knowing the logistics, the trains, the camps, the death toll, it is not enough. To know the Holocaust is to feel the loss in every silence. To see the empty streets where ghettos once lived. To understand that millions of stories stopped abruptly. To realize that the world ended for them long before liberation. The ghettos, once filled with laughter, songs, markets, families, culture, resistance, and hope, are now dust. Their people lie in unmarked graves, in ash pits, beneath forests, beneath roads, beneath fields where flowers grow unknowingly above them. And the world, finally forced to confront the truth, must decide whether remembering is enough, whether justice is enough, whether human beings will learn from this, or whether it will become another chapter studied, understood, and then quietly placed back on a shelf. The ashes of the ghettos settled across Europe. The ashes of the camps drifted across continents. And the ashes of the dead live on in the memories of the survivors who carried their voices forward. The final reckoning of the ghettos is this: they were not the end. They were not the beginning. They were the bridge. The bridge between segregation and annihilation. Between cruelty and machinery. Between life and death. And as the last survivors age, as their voices grow softer, as time steals witnesses, one truth becomes clear: the world carries their story now. The responsibility is ours. The memory is ours. The warning is ours. Because if the world forgets how the ghettos became ashes, how the trains became factories of death, how the camps became graves for millions, then silence will rise again. And the same machinery, indifference, bureaucracy, hatred, could return. The dead cannot speak. The survivors are fading. The documents do not cry. The photographs do not scream. But we can. We must. This is the legacy of the ghettos. This is the legacy of the camps. This is the legacy of the 6 million, and it will remain only as long as the living choose to remember.